The emergency doors of Meridian Cross Medical Center shattered inward at 12:47 a.m. as 6 black SUVs locked down the parking structure and 43 armed special operations soldiers flooded the building in full tactical gear. Doctors dove behind desks. Nurses pressed against walls. The commander, a man with 3 stars on his collar and a scar across his jaw, grabbed the charge nurse by the arm and said 4 words that stopped every heart in the room. "Where's Nora Voss?" The charge nurse blinked. "The nurse we just fired? Where is she? She's gone. She was let go 20 minutes ago. She was terrible. She couldn't handle—" The commander's expression didn't change. It didn't need to. "That woman you just threw into the rain," he said quietly, "is the only reason half your staff is still breathing tonight. And you called her incompetent." Nobody laughed this time. But before we go further, if you've never seen a story flip everything you thought you knew in the first 5 minutes, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens next, because this series is only getting started. Tap the like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because the night Nora Voss was fired was the night the truth ran out of places to hide. The rain had been coming down since 9. It wasn't dramatic rain, not the kind that announces itself with thunder and makes people feel like something important is about to happen. It was the flat, cold, relentless kind that soaks through jackets in under 3 minutes and makes the whole world look like a parking lot under a gray light. Nora Voss stood at the ambulance bay of Meridian Cross Medical Center in Harwich, a mid-sized city on the eastern coast that smelled like diesel and old salt water, and she watched the sky do exactly nothing useful. She had worked a 12-hour shift, technically. She had been on her feet for 14. The trauma bay had been a wreck since 6 p.m., 2 vehicle accidents, 1 overdose, a construction fall, and a teenager with a burst appendix who'd been sitting in the waiting room for 3 hours because the intake paperwork got lost somewhere between the front desk and a physician who couldn't be bothered to check the queue. Nora had flagged the teenager twice. She had gone to the desk, pointed at the chart, said the words peritoneal signs in plain English to the resident covering triage, and been told to manage her own patients and leave the assessments to the people with medical degrees. The teenager made it to surgery in time, just barely. Nobody thanked her. That was fine. She hadn't been expecting thanks. In the 14 months she'd worked at Meridian Cross, Nora Voss had learned to operate on a very narrow emotional budget. Do the work, keep the patients alive, go home, sleep, come back. She had built a life around the principle of making herself small enough to disappear into the machinery of the ER without drawing attention, because attention was the one thing she genuinely could not afford. She was good at the job. She knew that. She also knew that nobody here knew how good, and she intended to keep it that way. The problem was Dr. Marcus Hale. Dr. Marcus Hale was the chief physician of the Meridian Cross Emergency Department, 44 years old, Harvard Medical, the kind of man who wore his credentials the way other men wore cologne, constantly and in quantities that made people around him mildly uncomfortable. He had a handshake that he used as a dominance assessment and a habit of addressing nurses by their first names in a tone that made the first name sound like a correction. He was not the worst physician Nora had ever encountered. She had known worse. But he was thorough in his particular brand of condescension, and he had decided somewhere in the first 2 weeks of her employment that Nora Voss was a problem, not because she was bad at her job, because she was too quiet about being good at it, and that made him nervous in ways he'd never consciously identified. Tonight had started the way most bad nights started, with something small going wrong. Nora had been restocking the crash cart in Bay 4 when she'd heard Hale on the other side of the curtain, presenting a treatment plan to the family of a 61-year-old man named Gerald Ostroff, who'd come in with chest tightness and left arm pain that had been going on intermittently for 6 days. Hale's plan was to run a standard EKG, check troponins, and, pending results, discharge with a referral to cardiology within the week. Nora had kept her hands on the crash cart. She had listened to Hale's tone, confident, slightly rushed, wrapping up, and she had thought about Gerald Ostroff's intake form, which she had read 40 minutes earlier because she read every intake form in her section. She had thought about the notation that his pain was worse when lying flat. She had thought about the fact that his EKG had been read as borderline normal by a second-year resident who had been awake for 22 hours. She had stepped around the curtain. "Dr. Hale, can I have a word?" He had looked at her the way people look at a vending machine that's made an unexpected noise. "I'm with a patient, Voss." "I know. I'll be quick." She kept her voice low. "I think we should consider Welland syndrome. The T-wave inversions in V2 and V3 on his strip. The resident's read was normal, but I've looked at it twice, and I think those changes are consistent with proximal LAD stenosis. He needs a cardiology consult tonight, not next week." Hale stared at her for a long moment. "You read the EKG." "I looked at the strip, yes." "You're a nurse." "I'm aware." The resident cleared it. "The resident has been on since yesterday morning. I'm not questioning his competence. I'm flagging something I think is worth a second opinion from cardiology before we discharge." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Gerald Ostroff looked between the doctor and the nurse with the confused expression of a man who had just realized that the people responsible for his health might not be entirely in agreement about his health, which was exactly the kind of moment no patient should have to experience, and which Hale seemed to understand because he smiled, the professional kind, the one that costs nothing and means less, and said, "Thank you, Nurse Voss. I'll take it from here." She went back to the crash cart. 20 minutes later, she checked the board. Gerald Ostroff, discharged. Referral placed for outpatient cardiology follow-up in 7 to 10 business days. She stood at the board for a moment. Then she went back to work. The shift continued. The rain got worse. Bay 2 cycled through 3 patients in 2 hours. The overdose in Bay 7 stabilized and was transferred to the ICU. Nora managed her section, covered a gap when the other nurse on her rotation had to step out. And at some point around 10:30, she noticed that a patient 2 bays over, a construction worker named Terrence, who'd come in for what the chart called a laceration with possible foreign body, was running a fever of 101.4 that hadn't been documented anywhere, and which the attending on that side of the department hadn't been told about. She documented it. She told the attending. The attending said he'd get to it. She followed up 15 minutes later. The attending got testy. She followed up again because the fever had climbed to 102.1, and Terrence was starting to look confused and his blood pressure had ticked down 8 points since admission, which in a man who'd been sitting in a construction site in July heat was not a reassuring combination. At that point, the attending called Hale. Hale came over, looked at the chart, looked at the updated vitals, looked at Nora. "You've been monitoring another department's patient," he said. "I noticed he was deteriorating." "He's not your patient." "He's a patient." Hale's expression shifted in a way that she recognized. Not anger exactly, more like the specific irritation of a man who has decided that a problem needs to be dealt with before it becomes a larger problem. "Voss," he said, "you've been here 14 months. In that time you have questioned 3 attending physicians, 2 residents, and now me, twice in one shift. Do you understand how that looks?" She looked at him directly. She knew how that looked. She had spent years learning to keep that look neutral and unthreatening and appropriately deferential. And she was tired, and her wet jacket was hanging in the break room, and somewhere across the ER, Gerald Ostroff was going home with a referral that might or might not get followed up in time, and she was tired. "It looks like I'm doing my job," she said. That was the wrong thing to say. She knew it when she said it. She said it anyway. Hale straightened. "I'd like you to clock out for the night. We'll talk about your future here tomorrow. I'm in the middle of... Janelle will cover your patients. Clock out." She looked at him for one more second. Then she got her jacket from the break room, clocked out at 11:58 p.m., and walked out into the rain. She had been standing at the ambulance bay for about 6 minutes, waiting for it to feel like anything in particular, when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. That was fine. Unknown numbers were the only ones she picked up. She answered. "It's Decker," the voice said. Her hand tightened on the phone. She hadn't heard that name in over 2 years. She hadn't wanted to. Ryan Decker had been her communications specialist during 3 deployments, the kind of man who could locate a signal in a dead zone and route it through 3 satellites in under 40 seconds, and who had exactly 2 emotional settings, professionally calm and professionally calmer. She had trusted him with her life in situations where that phrase meant something specific and literal. She had not expected to hear from him again. "Wrong number," she said. "Nora, I need you to listen." That's not my name." "Okay, then I need you to listen anyway, because I've got a situation and you're the only person I can call." A pause. The connection had a slight digital flatness to it that told her he was using an encrypted line. "There's a man in your hospital right now. He came in as a trauma patient, probable highway accident. His name on the intake will be James Ford. That is not his name. He is one of ours." She turned slowly and looked back at the sliding glass doors of the ER entrance. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see the familiar controlled chaos of the trauma bay, the movement of staff, the green glow of monitors, the overhead lights. "I'm not employed there anymore," she said. "I just got fired." A beat of silence. "Nora, 40 minutes ago, so whatever you need." "He's been exposed to Veteran 7. Decker's voice didn't change register. It never did. "If your staff treats him for standard trauma, he will be dead within 2 hours, probably less." She stopped. Veteran 7. She hadn't heard that designation spoken out loud in 4 years, but it landed in her memory with the specific gravity of something you don't forget. A modified organophosphate compound, military grade, engineered for slow activation to complicate identification and treatment, developed by a contractor whose name she was not supposed to know, and did anyway. She had seen what it did to tissue. She had seen it do that to a person she was responsible for, once, in a situation she had spent 2 years trying to stop replaying. "Where did he pick it up?" she said. "We're still working on that. Nora, he's critical. I have a team en route, but they're 40 minutes out minimum. He does not have 40 minutes if they push the wrong treatment." She was already walking back toward the doors. "I need you to do something for me first," she said. "There's a patient named Gerald Ostroff who was discharged from Meridian Cross within the last half hour. I need someone to make sure he gets back in tonight." What?" "Possible Wellens syndrome. He could be heading for an MI. Can your team intercept?" A pause. "I'll make a call." "Good." She pushed through the sliding doors. "Now tell me everything you know about the operative's current condition." The ER was loud and fluorescent and smelled like antiseptic and wet clothing. Nobody looked up when she walked back in. She was a nurse in scrubs. She looked like she belonged here, which was the only advantage she'd maintained in 14 months of making herself invisible. She moved through the department the way she'd learned to move in field conditions, purposeful, unhurried, invisible through the simple act of looking like you were supposed to be exactly where you were. She found James Ford in Bay 9. He was on a backboard, partially immobilized with a cervical collar that he didn't need, and an IV line running saline that was the right call for the wrong reasons. The resident managing him, a young woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who was competent and clearly exhausted, had ordered a standard trauma panel and was waiting on imaging. Nora stood at the foot of the bed and assessed in the way she'd been trained to assess before she'd been trained as a nurse. The man was in his late 30s, dark-haired, strong build, going slack in a way that suggested his muscles were losing voluntary tone faster than any blunt force trauma would explain. There was a faint smell yet, not blood, not antiseptic, something chemical and slightly sweet that sat underneath everything else, like a word in a sentence you had to reread to catch. His skin around the neck and jaw had a grayish undertone that the overhead lights were washing out, but she could see it. His fingertips. The color at his nail beds. His eyes were open. They tracked her. That was important. "Hey," she said quietly. She leaned in, kept her voice low. "James, I'm going to help you. I need you to try to stay still." His jaw moved. He was trying to say something. She couldn't hear it. She checked his pupils. Pinpoint constriction, not concussion, not opioids. The talk screen wouldn't show it because it wasn't in any standard panel. She checked his muscle tone with 2 fingers against his forearm and felt the beginning of the fasciculations, tiny, rapid, involuntary muscle twitches that looked like nothing unless you knew what you were looking for and felt exactly like the beginning of a very specific kind of cascade. She stood up and turned around. Dr. Anand was at the workstation 6 feet away. "The patient in Bay 9, Nora said. He needs atropine. He needs it now, and he needs pralidoxime after that. The imaging can wait." Anand looked up, looked at her. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "Nora Voss. I'm a nurse on the floor." She kept her voice level. "I know how this looks. I also know that man is showing cholinergic toxidrome, the meiosis, the fasciculations, the secretions building in his upper airway. He wasn't in an accident. He's been poisoned." Anand's expression went through 3 stages in about 2 seconds. Surprise, skepticism, and then the particular focused stillness of a physician who is actually listening. "His blood work won't show it on a standard panel. This is an organophosphate compound. You need to treat empirically." She kept her voice calm and even, and completely without urgency, because she'd learned a long time ago that urgency makes people defensive, and defensiveness kills patients. "I'm not asking you to trust me without question. I'm asking you to look at him and tell me those pupils are normal." Anand looked at the bed. She looked at the pupils. A beat. "His temp is climbing," Anand said, almost to herself. "I've been watching his BP and it's been—" She stopped. "Bronchospasms are starting. I thought it was a reaction to the collar." She was already moving. "I need to confirm with the attending. There's no time to—" "Nurse Voss." The voice came from behind her. She knew it before she turned around. Marcus Hale was standing at the entrance to Bay 9 with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face that was past irritation and into something colder. Behind him, 2 security officers stood at a professional distance that was not actually professional distance. It was the distance of people who had been told to wait right there and were waiting right there. "You clocked out," Hale said. "I did." "You're not authorized to be in this department." "I understand." She kept her position. "Dr. Hale, the patient in this bay has been exposed to a cholinesterase inhibitor. He needs a troponization and oxime therapy, not trauma protocol. If you push fluids and don't address the bronchospasm, he's going to arrest within. This is not your patient. That doesn't change his physiology." "How are you diagnosing this? On what basis?" She took a breath. She needed to give him something he could process quickly, and she needed to not give him anything he'd remember later. "Meiosis, fasciculations on palpation, the smell, there's a sweet chemical odor consistent with certain organophosphates. I worked rural trauma before I came here. I've seen agricultural exposure cases. This presentation, you're diagnosing a man by smell." Hale said it the way people say things they intend to be devastating. "You've been on shift for 14 hours, you've been dismissed, and you are now in a restricted area diagnosing a patient by smell. I'm telling you what I see." "Security." Hale turned. "Please escort Nurse Voss out." "Dr. Hale, now." She looked at Anand. The resident was frozen between the workstation and the bed, looking at the patient, looking at Hale, doing the math that residents always had to do. The math of what you believe against the math of what authority is telling you to do. Nora had done that math herself, once, in a very different context, and she knew which way it usually came out. She let the security officers walk her toward the exit. She didn't resist. She kept her face neutral and her breathing even, and she thought about the 40 minutes Decker had given her, and she did her own math. The bay doors slid open and the rain hit her face. She was outside again, for the second time tonight. She stood there for a moment, her phone already in her hand, already dialing. Decker picked up on half a ring. "I've been removed from the building," she said. "Your man is in Bay 9. They're running trauma protocol. Anand, the resident." She was listening, but Hale shut it down. "I need your team here faster than 40 minutes. "I'm working on it." A pause. "Nora, there's something else." "What?" "The compound on this operative, it's Vitrine 7, but it's been modified. We've been tracking that modification for 8 months. Only one source in the world is producing it." She stood in the rain and waited. "The people who made you disappear 2 years ago," Decker said, "they're connected to this. This isn't a coincidence that he ended up in your hospital." The ambulance bay was quiet except for the rain and the distant sound of the highway. The lights above the entrance flickered once. Power fluctuation. The building's old electrical system arguing with the weather. Through the glass, she could see the ER and its bright, noisy, ordinary life. People moving between beds, monitors cycling, the 1,000 small rituals of medicine running on parallel tracks. And in Bay 9, a man dying from something nobody inside could name. She looked down at her hands. She'd been in the rain long enough that her fingers were going cold. She'd been a nurse for 14 months and a soldier for 8 years before that, and she had not wanted tonight to be the night those two things collided. She had been careful. She had been invisible. She had built something small and sustainable, and hers, and she had known, in the back of her mind that she tried not to visit too often, that it was always temporary. She put the phone in her pocket. She pulled her badge, the badge she'd been told to surrender and hadn't surrendered because nobody had actually asked her to hand it in. They just told her to leave, which was a different thing. And she looked at it for a second. Then she turned around. She had been a field medic in 2 theaters of combat. She had treated nerve agent exposure in a forward operating base with equipment that cost less than the vending machine in the Meridian Cross break room. She had done it under fire, in the dark, with people shooting at the building she was in. She had done it while someone she was responsible for was dying in her arms, and she had gotten him out, mostly, in the ways that matter, and some of the ways that don't. And she had carried that weight for years, and she would carry it for the rest of whatever this life turned out to be. She was not going to stand in a parking lot in the rain while a man she didn't know died because a physician with good credentials and bad instincts wouldn't listen to a nurse he'd already decided didn't matter. She walked back toward the doors. The badge worked on the first swipe. Inside, she turned left toward the supply corridor, away from the main floor. She kept her pace even. She counted doors. She knew this hospital's layout the way she knew the layout of every building she'd spent significant time in, not because she was paranoid, because she was trained, and the training didn't turn off when the uniform came off. She found the emergency pharmaceutical cabinet in the secondary supply room, and she used her access code, still active. 14 months of access didn't expire the second Hale said the word. And she pulled atropine. Pralidoxim. She checked the dosages against the weight she'd estimated from the patient's build, and she pulled the right amounts and she moved. She came back into the bay corridor from the supply side entrance, which put her behind the nursing station and out of Hale's immediate sightline, and she went straight to Bay 9. Anand was at the bedside now. The resident had made her own decision in the time Nora had been gone. She'd pulled a consult and was on the phone with someone, her voice low and tight. And the patient's monitors were alarming in the specific pattern of a man whose respiratory system was losing the argument against itself. Nora stepped in. "I have atropine and pralidoxime," she said quietly. Anand looked at her. A half second of something. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of someone who had made a decision and was looking at the thing that would make that decision real. "He's going into bronchospasm. His O2 is dropping." "I know." Nora was already moving to the IV line. 2 milligrams atropine to start, then titrate. We'll push pralidoxime over 30 minutes once he's stable enough. Do you want to do it, or do you want me to walk you through it? Anand took the syringe. She was good. The resident was good. Nora had watched her work for 14 months without ever having to say so. And she was good, and her hands were steady, and she administered the atropine with the clean economy of someone who had decided that the right thing and the necessary thing were the same thing tonight. The monitors didn't stabilize immediately. That was normal. That was correct. Atropinization in a cholinergic crisis was a process, not a switch, and Nora stood at the bedside and watched the numbers and adjusted and talked the resident through the titration and kept her voice at the same flat, informational register she'd used in field conditions because that register did something to the air in a room. It made people believe that the situation was manageable, that someone in the room had been here before and knew the way through, which was either deeply reassuring or a sophisticated lie, and in Nora's experience was usually some percentage of both. 8 minutes in, the patient's oxygen saturation began to climb. 12 minutes in, the bronchospasm broke. 15 minutes in, James Ford's eyes focused on the ceiling above him, and his chest moved with something that was almost a normal breath, ragged and shallow, but voluntary. And his lips moved, and this time Nora could hear what he was trying to say. She leaned in. "They know about the list," he said. His voice was wrecked. They know she has it. They'll... A cough, a long pause. They'll come for it. Tonight. Nora was still for a moment. What list? She said quietly. But he was gone again. Not dead, just unconscious. His body shutting down non-essential systems to concentrate on the ones that mattered. She straightened up and looked at Anand, and then looked past Anand toward the entrance to the bay. Because she had been in enough deteriorating situations to know what the sound of multiple people arriving in a coordinated way sounds like, and she was hearing it now from the direction of the ambulance bay. It was not Decker's team. The silhouette that crossed the bay window first was wrong. The build, the stride, the way the second and third figures fanned out to either side of the first, in a pattern that had nothing to do with hospital staff, and everything to do with people who had been trained to enter a space and control it within the first 10 seconds. Nora put her hand on Anand's arm. Call a code, she said quietly. Real or not, call it now. You want this room full of your people. Anand looked at her. Now, Nora said. The alarm went off and the corridor outside flooded with staff, and Nora stepped back into the shadow of the supply alcove and assessed the three figures now moving through the ER with the specific contained urgency of people who were looking for something and already knew where it was. And somewhere outside in the rain, a convoy of black vehicles was 8 minutes out. 8 minutes was a long time. 8 minutes was also nothing at all. 8 minutes was a long time when you had nothing to do but wait. It was nothing at all when you were the only thing standing between 3 armed men and a patient who couldn't stand on his own. Nora pressed herself into the supply alcove and watched the 3 figures move through the ER with the patient efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. They weren't running. Running drew attention. They walked the way she had walked 100 times in spaces that weren't hers, with enough purpose to look like they belonged and enough restraint to not announce what they were actually doing. 2 of them peeled off toward the nursing station. The third kept moving toward Bay 9. She had maybe 12 seconds. The code alarm was still running. That helped. A code alarm turned a hospital corridor into controlled chaos. Staff converging from 3 directions, crash cart being wheeled out, voices overlapping, everyone's attention pulled toward the sound and away from the edges of the room where things you weren't supposed to see were happening. She had counted on that. She had also counted on the fact that the man moving toward Bay 9 would slow down at the entrance, would take a second to orient himself, would not expect anyone to already be inside that alcove 3 feet to his left. She let him take 1 step past her, and then she grabbed his collar and put her body weight behind a pivot that slammed him into the supply shelf hard enough to rattle the IV bags and knock a box of gloves to the floor. She had his arm up behind his back before he could recover his balance. She pressed him against the shelf and held him there and said quietly into the back of his head, "Don't." He stopped. She could feel him assessing, testing the angle, calculating the leverage, deciding whether the grip she had was breakable. It was. She knew it was. She also knew he knew that she knew, and that kind of mutual acknowledgement sometimes bought more time than actual force. The patient in Bay 9 is receiving treatment, she said. Her voice was the same flat register. If you go in there right now, you will interrupt a critical intervention, and he will die. That's not a threat. That's physiology. A beat. Who are you? The man said. Someone who just saved your asset's life. So I'd like you to take about 30 seconds and think carefully about what happens next. Another beat. Longer. Let go of my arm, he said. She released him and stepped back, keeping the shelf between them and watching his hands. He straightened, turned around, and looked at her with an expression that was doing a lot of calculation in a very short time. He was mid-40s, military haircut, grown out by about 3 weeks, wearing civilian clothes that fit the same way military clothes fit, correctly, without vanity. There was a comms piece in his left ear. He's alive, the man said. He's stable for the moment. Atropine and pralidoxime. The resident is managing him. She kept her eyes on his hands. Call off your other 2. The 2 at the nursing station. Call them off before they do something that makes this harder to explain. He looked at her for another second. Then he touched his ear. Stand down. Hold position. He lowered his hand. How did you know what he'd been exposed to? I recognized the presentation. From where? She said nothing. He looked at her differently after that. The calculation in his expression shifted into something that was not quite recognition, but was adjacent to it. The specific look of someone who has encountered a data point that doesn't fit the model they were using and is now revising the model in real time. "The team coming in," he started. 8 minutes, maybe less now. She moved past him toward the bay. "Stay out here and keep your people quiet. The last thing this patient needs is more variables in that room." She went back to Bay 9. Anand was managing the second pralidoxime push. The patient's vitals were still unstable. His blood pressure was doing things it shouldn't, responding too slowly to the atropine, and his respiratory rate was still elevated, and the monitor was alarming every 90 seconds with a consistency that meant the alarm was becoming part of the background and therefore becoming useless, which was its own kind of danger. Nora went to the monitor and adjusted the threshold parameters so only the critical alerts would trigger. Anand looked at her but didn't say anything. The code team had arrived and then been redirected when Anand told them the situation was contained. There were 2 other nurses in the bay now, Carla Ruiz, who Nora had worked alongside for a year, and who was one of the genuinely good ones, and a travel nurse whose name Nora didn't know. Both of them were watching Nora with expressions that sat somewhere between confused and grateful, which was fine. Gratitude she could work with, confusion she could work around. "His pressure is still dropping," Anand said. "I know." Nora checked the line. "How long since the last atropine dose?" 6 minutes. "Push another milligram." "His muscarinic symptoms are still overriding." She checked the clock on the wall. "And get me a blood pressure cuff we can cycle every 2 minutes. The continuous monitor is giving us lag." Carla was already moving for the cuff. The next 4 minutes were the kind of minutes that felt longer than they were. The kind where you were watching numbers and adjusting and watching again, and the numbers were moving in the right direction, but slowly, too slowly. The kind of slowly that sat in your chest like a held breath. Nora had been in worse situations. She had managed worse with less. She knew the difference between a patient who was losing and a patient who was fighting, and James Ford was fighting, his body doing the ugly, inefficient work of trying to correct a chemistry that had been deliberately sabotaged, and the medications helping, and the numbers moving, and eventually the blood pressure ticked up 5 points, and then another 3. And she let herself exhale once, and then went back to watching. The bay doors opened. Marcus Hale walked in with the specific energy of a man who had just been told something he didn't believe, and had come to disprove it personally. He stopped when he saw the IV lines, the medication packaging, the configuration of people around the bed. "What is this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Anand answered, "Dr. Hale, I've initiated treatment for suspected cholinergic toxidrome, organophosphate exposure. The patient's presentation is consistent, and he's responding to atropine and pralidoxime. His O2 sat has come up from 81 to 93 in the last 14 minutes. Hale looked at the monitor, at the patient, at Nora. "You came back in," he said. "I did." "After I told you to leave?" "Yes." "After security escorted you out?" "Also yes." She kept her hands where they were, one on the IV line, one on the bed rail. "Dr. Hale, you can deal with that part after. Right now I need you to look at this patient's response curve and tell me what you want to do with the second pralidoxime infusion." He didn't look at the chart. He looked at her. "You could lose your license," he said. "I'm aware. You could be charged with unauthorized—" "Dr. Hale." She turned to face him fully. He was going to die. His O2 was at 78 when I came back in. He had maybe 6 minutes before respiratory arrest, and nobody in this room knew what was happening to him. You can be angry at me for the rest of your career. Right now he needs a physician making decisions, and that's you, not me. So I need to know what you want to do." The room was very quiet for about 4 seconds. Hale looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. The gradual return of color, the steadying respiratory rate, the numbers on the screen doing the thing that numbers were supposed to do. He picked up the chart. He read it in the particular focused silence of a physician who was absorbing information and trying very hard to remain the authority in a situation he had not controlled. "Continue the pralidoxime," he said finally, "and get me a neurological assessment. I want GCS every 15 minutes. He set the chart down. "Someone get me a consult from toxicology." Toxicology is going to need to know what compound, Anand started. Tell them to treat empirically until we have more information. He turned toward the door. And someone get security back in here. He left. Carla Ruiz looked at Nora over the patient's legs. You know they're going to arrest you, Carla said quietly. Probably. Was it worth it? Nora looked at the monitor, at the number that was now reading 94%, at the man in the bed who was unconscious but breathing, whose heart was beating in a rhythm that was irregular but present. She thought about what he'd said before he lost consciousness. They know she has it. They'll come for it tonight. She didn't know what the list was. She didn't know who they were, specifically beyond the shape of something she'd been trying not to think about for 2 years. But she knew that the man in this bed had been put here deliberately, that someone had poisoned him and arranged for him to arrive in a hospital where identification of that poison would be nearly impossible, and that the same someone had reason to believe that hospital was connected to her, which meant that whoever was running this had known where she was, which meant her 2 years of invisibility had not been as invisible as she'd thought. Yeah, she said. It was worth it. She was halfway through the thought of what to do next when the sound hit. Not an explosion, not exactly. More like a pressure shift, the way a room sounds when something large and fast moves through the air nearby, followed immediately by the sharp secondary crack of something structural taking impact. The lights in Bay 9 flickered, held, and then the hospital PA system emitted a feedback squeal that cut through everything before going dead. Carla grabbed the IV pole. Anand looked at the ceiling. That was outside, the travel nurse said. That was close. Nora was already at the bay window. Through the glass, she could see the ambulance bay at an angle, the overhang, the rain-slicked asphalt, the yellow emergency lights. One of those lights was now dark. A vehicle she hadn't seen before was parked sideways across the ambulance access lane, and the 2 men who'd been standing near it were not standing near it anymore. They were down. Her phone went off. There's a second unit, Decker said before she could speak. Not ours. They came in from the service road on the east side. Nora, they're not here for Ford. They're here for what he was carrying. What was he carrying? A drive. Physical. Encrypted but crackable with enough time and hardware. It has names on it. People inside the Callaway group who've been moving modified compounds through civilian supply chains. If that drive disappears tonight, where is it? A pause. It was on him when he came in. His personal effects would have been bagged at intake, she said. Locked storage. Bay 9's adjacent to processing. Nora. I know. She turned back to the room. Carla, lock this bay. Don't open it for anyone who doesn't have hospital ID and who isn't me or Dr. Anand. If someone tries to force entry, hit the internal alarm, not the standard code, the fire panel. It'll seal the corridors. Carla looked at her. What's happening? Something I'll explain later. Can you do that? A beat. Nora was aware that she was asking a nurse she'd worked alongside for a year to barricade herself in a room with a critically ill patient based on nothing more than her word. And that was not a small thing to ask, and Carla knew it. Yeah, Carla said. I've got him. Nora went out the bay door moving fast. The ER had changed in the last 4 minutes. The code alarm had been replaced by a different sound. The hospital's external emergency notification, a tone that meant something was happening in the facility that was not a medical event, and the staff had been trained on it. But training and reality were different things, and the corridor was now a mixture of people doing the right things and people standing still because they didn't know what the right thing was and couldn't decide. She moved through it the way she'd moved through worse, with her eyes tracking the perimeter, the exits, the points of entry, the faces of people who were moving wrong. The man from the alcove, the one she'd put into the supply shelf, fell into step beside her. The east entrance, she said. We know. My team is redirecting. How many in the second unit? Minimum 4, could be more. He was keeping pace without effort, which told her what she already suspected about his training. There's a problem. 1. The drive. Ford was carrying it in a subcutaneous carrier, so standard field concealment, sutured into the lateral torso. Your medical team will have missed it on intake because it reads as scar tissue on imaging. She stopped walking. It's still on him. Yes. She looked back toward Bay 9. Through the corridor window, she could see the sealed bay door, Carla's shape moving inside. She looked forward toward the processing area, toward the east corridor where the emergency notification was still sounding and where, behind a set of fire doors, 4 or more people were trying to get to a man who was unconscious and unable to protect himself, and who was carrying something that apparently had the power to collapse whatever the Calloway group was, which was a name she'd heard once, 2 years ago, in a classified briefing she wasn't supposed to have attended. She had attended anyway. She started moving again. I need to go back to Ford, she said. My team can... Your team doesn't know where the carrier is or how to access it without compromising his recovery. I need to go back. She turned a corner. What I need from you is to keep whatever is coming through that east door away from Bay 9 for the next 15 minutes. I can give you 10. Then give me 10. She pushed back through the bay door. Carla turned around fast, hand going to the crash cart before she registered Nora's face. We need to do a secondary assessment, Nora said, moving to the bedside. Lateral torso, both sides. I'm looking for a sutured insertion, probably 3 to 4 centimeters, left or right flank. Anand looked up from the monitor. What? He's carrying something. It's not medical. It's intelligence. And I need to secure it before the people who want it get through a set of fire doors on the east side of the building. The room went very quiet. Anand set down the clipboard. She looked at Nora with an expression that Nora recognized. Not disbelief, but the particular look of a person who has been presented with a situation that requires them to decide, fast, how much they trust their read on another person. Anand had been a resident for 2 years. She had good instincts, and she was tired, and she was in a room where a dying man was alive because of something she hadn't done alone, and that mattered. Left side, Anand said. There was an anomaly on the lateral scan. I thought it was artifact. Nora was already at the bedside, lifting the hospital gown carefully. She ran her fingers along the left lateral torso, below the last rib, and found it in under 30 seconds. A raised seam, clean surgical work, tight sutures, approximately 4 centimeters. Not an old scar. Recent work, maybe 72 hours old. I need a suture kit, she said. You're going to open him. Carefully. He's stable enough and I'll close it clean. I need the kit and I need someone watching that door. The travel nurse went to the cabinet without being asked. Nora didn't know her name still, and there wasn't time to ask, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that she moved when Nora spoke, which was either good training or good instincts, and either one worked. Nora opened the suture line with a precision that she hadn't needed in 14 months, and which came back to her fingers the way certain things come back. Not smoothly, not with the cinematic ease that stories assign to muscle memory, but with the effortful, slightly halting return of a skill that was real and deep, and had cost her things she didn't like to count. Her hands were steady. They were not perfect. She nicked the outer layer of subcutaneous tissue on the first pass and adjusted and went again, and Ford's body registered nothing because he was under and his pain response was muted by the atropine, and she was grateful for that and guilty about the gratitude at the same time, which was a feeling she'd had before. The carrier was there, a sealed polymer case, thumb-sized, smooth. She extracted it carefully, closed the incision with 4 clean, interrupted sutures, dressed it, and straightened up. She was holding a drive that apparently had enough names on it to dismantle a network that had been operating inside legitimate institutions for long enough to feel permanent. She looked at it in her palm for a moment. Then the fire door at the east end of the corridor blew open. Not a small sound. A concussive crack followed by the specific racket of a metal door hitting a concrete wall and the rush of footsteps that was too fast to be hospital staff responding to an emergency. It was the sound of people who weren't trying to be quiet anymore because they'd decided they didn't need to be. She could hear Decker's team responding in the corridor, voices, a physical altercation, something heavy going into a wall. And she knew that whatever the 10 minutes he'd promised her were going to look like, she was in the middle of them. She put the drive in the chest pocket of her scrub top and pressed her hand flat against it. Stay down, she said to the room, and she meant all of them. Anand, Carla, the travel nurse, the man in the bed. And she went to the bay door and opened it 2 inches and looked out into the corridor. Two of Decker's people were holding the east corridor. A third was down. Not dead, she didn't think, but down, on one knee, hand pressed to his shoulder. The people coming through the east door numbered at least 5, and 2 of them had broken past the first line of defense and were moving through the ER with the controlled aggression of people who had done this in harder places than a hospital corridor on a rainy Wednesday night. The ER staff were pressing back against walls, behind desks, under workstations. Patients in open bays were exposed. A woman with an IV in her arm was crouched behind her bed frame, her face pressed into the mattress. A child, small, maybe 7, in a pediatric bay near the center of the floor, was sitting up in bed with his eyes wide, not understanding what was happening, which was the only mercy in the situation. Nora looked at the child. She looked at the 2 armed men moving through her ER. She had the drive in her pocket and 10 seconds of clear corridor to the left and a stairwell exit that would put her in the parking structure, and she could run and she could let Decker's team handle the rest, and she could be invisible again by morning. She looked at the child. She closed the bay door, turned to Carla, and said, "Give me the crash cart, the defibrillator unit. I need it unplugged and in the corridor in 30 seconds. Carla blinked. "You're going out there. Just get me the cart." She didn't wait for the argument she could see forming. She opened the door, got behind the cart as Carla wheeled it to her, and pushed it out into the corridor with the specific, unhurried purpose of a nurse who was just doing exactly what nurses do, because the best cover in a hospital was a nurse doing exactly what nurses do. And nobody questioned the crash cart, not even the people who'd breached the fire door, because the crash cart was a universal signal of something that was not their problem. She got 12 feet down the corridor before the first man saw her. He was close, closer than she'd expected, which told her the first line of Decker's people had fallen back further than planned. He had a sidearm at his hip, but he hadn't drawn it, because guns in hospitals were complicated for everyone, including the people holding them. And she used that half-second of his reassessment to put the crash cart between them and pivot into a workstation alcove that put 3 layers of equipment between her body and his. "Hey!" She kept her voice at nurse normal. "We have a critical patient in 9. I need this bay clear." He was looking at her, reading her. She could see him trying to place her in the schema of this situation. Was she a problem, or was she the problem? Was she covering or running? Did she have anything he needed? His eyes dropped to her chest pocket. There it was. He'd been told what to look for. Of course he had. The polymer case was a standard field carrier, and anyone running this operation would know exactly what it looked like and approximately where it would be, because whoever had briefed them had access to information that came from inside. She had exactly 1 second before he made a decision. She hit the code blue button on the workstation behind her, and every alarm in the ER went off simultaneously, and in the burst of sound and light and the sudden surge of people responding to the code, she moved left into the next alcove and kept moving. And the drive was in her pocket, and her heart was doing something it was not supposed to do, and somewhere at the front of the hospital, she heard the sound of vehicles, multiple, heavy, moving fast. And she recognized the sound because she'd heard it before, in other places. And it meant that the 40 minutes Decker had promised her had somehow become less than 20. And then the ER's main entrance doors came open with a controlled force that was not the same as the east door. Deliberate, ordered, announced by a voice that carried through the alarms and the chaos with the specific authority of someone who was used to being heard in situations where hearing was difficult. Federal authority, everyone on the floor, hands visible, medical personnel, identify yourselves. Nora pressed herself into the alcove and looked toward the entrance. The man in front wore tactical gear with no visible insignia. Behind him, 8 more, fanning out in the specific pattern of a trained entry that had been planned for this space. And in the middle, moving through the breach with his phone to his ear and his eyes already scanning the room for the one face he was looking for, was Ryan Decker. He found her. Across the ER, through the strobing alarm lights and the press of bodies and the 3 men who still hadn't been contained, Decker looked at Nora Voss standing in a workstation alcove with her hand pressed flat against her chest pocket, and his expression said everything that couldn't be said at volume across a room that was still not fully under control. She held up her other hand. 3 fingers. 3 of them still moving, still armed, still between the team and the floor. Decker turned and gave a signal she didn't need to see clearly to understand. And then everything happened at once, and the part of her that had been holding itself very still for 2 years felt something shift. Not release, not relief, nothing that clean, but the particular internal adjustment of a person who has been waiting for the thing they feared and who has been found by it and who is standing up anyway. The man who had been moving toward her chest pocket was now face down on the floor with a federal agent's knee between his shoulder blades. The child in the pediatric bay had a nurse over him now, one of the staff, brave and instinctive, who had crossed the floor during the chaos to cover him. James Ford was alive in Bay 9, and somewhere in the building, in a corridor she couldn't see, a second set of boots was moving. Not Decker's team, not the men who'd breached the east door, but a third element that had entered the hospital in the window when everyone's attention was on the east corridor and the main entrance, and which Nora became aware of not through sight or sound, but through the specific instinct she'd developed over 8 years of operating in places where instinct was the difference between a report and a memorial. She became aware of it because Marcus Hale had not come back to the ER floor. And Marcus Hale, for all his considerable faults, was not a man who stayed away from his department when his department was in crisis, which meant Marcus Hale was somewhere else, and somewhere else was starting to feel like exactly the wrong place to be. She moved before she finished the thought. That was the thing about certain kinds of training. It didn't wait for your conscious mind to catch up. Her body was already turning toward the administrative corridor before she'd fully articulated what was wrong, before she'd named it beyond the absence of Marcus Hale in a room where Marcus Hale should have been. The instinct wasn't clean or certain. It was just a pull. The way a smell pulls you back to a specific room in a specific year, involuntary and insistent. Decker was 30 feet away, coordinating his team's containment of the 3 remaining hostiles. She caught his eye and pointed toward the administrative wing. He shook his head, meaning stay put, meaning wait, meaning let the people with tactical training handle the parts that required tactical training. She understood that. She also understood that if she was right about Hale, every second she spent having this silent argument across a chaotic ER was a second in the wrong direction. She pointed again, more specific, administrative. Hale. Decker held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he peeled off one of his team, a woman, compact, moving the way people move when the movement is the whole sentence, and jerked his head toward Nora. The agent reached her in 10 seconds. Vasquez, she said by way of introduction. It was not a warm introduction. Nora Voss, the chief physician, hasn't been on the floor since the breach. He came back to this department, saw what was happening, and left. That's wrong. Wrong how? He doesn't leave his department. Whatever's happening here, his instinct would be to control it, to be the authority in the room. The only reason he'd leave is if he already knew what was happening and had somewhere specific to be. Vasquez looked at her. You're saying the physician is... I'm saying I don't know, and I'd like to find out before whoever's still loose in this building finds it first. They went. The administrative corridor connected to the main ER floor through a set of badge access doors near the physician's lounge, and it ran the length of the building's eastern spine. Offices, records, the pharmacy authorization suite, and at the far end, the security control room where the hospital's camera feeds and access logs were managed. Nora had been in the administrative wing exactly 3 times in 14 months, once for her employment intake, once for a mandatory safety training, and once because she'd gotten turned around after a late shift and ended up in the wrong corridor for 4 minutes before reorienting. She knew its shape, she didn't know its sounds. She knew something was wrong with its sounds now. The corridor should have been empty. It was past 1 in the morning and the administrative staff didn't work nights. And even if they had, the emergency situation on the main floor would have driven everyone either toward the ER to help or toward the exits to leave. But there was a sound coming from the direction of the security control room. Not loud, not dramatic. The specific low register of a conversation happening between people who were trying not to be heard. Vasquez held up a fist. Stop! And went ahead 2 steps to the corner, looked around it, came back. She held up 2 fingers. 2 people. Nora came to the corner and looked. Marcus Hale was standing outside the security control room with his phone pressed flat against his chest and his shoulders in the posture of a man who was having a conversation he didn't want recorded. The person he was talking to was a woman Nora didn't recognize, Not hospital staff, wrong clothes, wrong shoes. The kind of person whose entire presentation said, "I am not supposed to be here," and who was failing to say it quietly enough. The woman was handing Hale something, small, rectangular, a card, a drive. Nora couldn't tell from this distance. She could tell from Hale's body language that whatever he was receiving, he'd been expecting it. Vasquez pulled her back around the corner. "Did you know about him?" "No." "Does Decker?" "I don't know what Decker knows." She thought quickly. The drive was in her pocket. The original drive. The one she'd pulled from Ford's lateral suture. Whatever Hale was holding was either a copy, a decoy, or something else entirely, and she needed to know which one before Vasquez went around that corner and shut the conversation down, because a shutdown conversation told you nothing you hadn't already guessed. "Wait," she said. "We can't wait if he's—" 30 seconds. Let him finish. I want to hear where he's going with it." Vasquez looked like she had several professional objections to this, but she also looked like a person who understood situational judgment, and she waited. The conversation around the corner lasted 20 seconds more. Nora couldn't make out the words. Too low, the corridor acoustics working against her. But she heard tone, and the tone was transactional, not conspiratorial. Not fear, not urgency. The flat exchange of people completing a handoff that had been arranged in advance, which was somehow worse than fear, because fear meant surprise. And no surprise meant this had been planned before tonight, before the attack on Ford, before the breach. Hale had known. She heard footsteps, the woman leaving, moving away from them down the far corridor toward the building's east exit, which was now compromised, which meant she was walking into Decker's containment perimeter whether she knew it or not. Hale turned back toward the control room door. Vasquez went around the corner. "Dr. Hale, federal agent. Keep your hands where I can see them." Nora followed. Hale turned and his face did something complicated. Not surprise, not guilt, but the specific expression of a man whose calculation had just run out of variables. He looked at Vasquez. He looked at Nora. He looked at Nora longer, and something moved in his expression that was harder to name. "Nurse Voss," he said. "Dr. Hale." He held up his hands. In his right hand was a key card. Hospital issue, the kind used for records access. In his left hand, nothing. "Whatever you think you saw," he started. "I saw you receive something from an unauthorized individual in a restricted corridor during an active security breach," Vasquez said. "That's what I saw. What was she giving you?" "She's a colleague. She came to check on the situation. At 1 a.m, through the administrative wing." Vasquez stepped forward. "I need you to come with me." Hale's eyes went to Nora again. She couldn't read what he was looking for. Confirmation of something, maybe. Some signal that she understood something he thought she should understand, which she might, but not in the way he intended. "The patient in Bay 9, he said. "Ford." "He's stable," Nora said. "Is he going to make it?" "Why do you care?" A beat. Hale lowered his hand slowly. The calculation on his face had resolved into something that was almost relief, which made no sense, and Nora filed that alongside everything else she didn't have time to process. "Because I called them," he said. Vasquez went very still. "I called them," Hale said again. "Decker's team. I've been feeding information to a federal investigation for 11 months. The woman who just left is my handler. She was giving me an extraction document, in case tonight went wrong." He looked at his hands. "I think tonight went wrong." The silence in the corridor lasted about 3 seconds. Nora spent those 3 seconds revising the model she'd been running on Marcus Hale, which required significant reconstruction. She was not certain she believed him. She was not certain she disbelieved him. The truth of any person was rarely the shape you'd assigned them, which she knew better than most, and which she was finding, even now, even tonight, repeatedly relevant. "Get him to Decker," she said to Vasquez. "Decker will know who he is." She didn't wait for the response. She was already turning back toward the main floor. She was halfway down the administrative corridor when her phone went off. "Decker." "We've got a problem," he said. "I have at least 4. Which one's yours?" "Ford is awake." She stopped. "That's not a problem." He's awake, and he's trying to leave. He pulled his IV line. Anand can't hold him, and Nora, he thinks the breach team is still in the building, and he's trying to get to the control room to wipe the hospital's internal camera feeds. Why would he? Because one of the faces in those feeds is someone he was not supposed to be in contact with. Someone whose presence here, documented on hospital cameras, is going to create a problem for the investigation that we cannot fix. A pause. If those feeds go, we lose the visual confirmation we've been building for 8 months. She reversed direction, back toward the security control room. The keycard, she said. Hale had a hospital keycard. Records access sits. Does that cover security systems? Chief physician level access covers everything. She went back to where Vasquez was standing with Hale. The keycard, she said. I need it. Hale looked at her. She looked back. He held it out. She took it and ran. The security control room was 20 feet away. She badged in, found the camera management terminal in under 10 seconds. It was labeled because hospitals labeled everything on the assumption that the person operating it might be anyone, which was usually true and tonight was specifically true. The terminal was active. Someone had been in it recently. The session log showed access within the last 6 minutes, which was either the building's security guard or someone who wasn't the security guard, and the security guard was not in the room, so she didn't know the system well enough to lock it down herself. She knew enough to recognize that the camera feeds were still running. The monitors showed every corridor, every bay, the ambulance entrance, the administrative wing, and she found the administrative corridor feed. And she found the timestamp, and she found the 7-second window of Hale's exchange with the woman who was now in Decker's custody. And she removed the keycard from the reader so the session would require re-authentication before anyone could modify the archive. Then she called Decker. Feeds are intact. Get someone to this terminal right now. She didn't wait for confirmation. She left the keycard on the terminal and went back to the main floor because Ford was awake and pulling IV lines. And a man who'd been in cholinergic crisis 20 minutes ago had no business pulling IV lines, and if he went into secondary arrest because his atropine had been interrupted, she was going to be genuinely angry. The ER had changed again in the time she'd been in the administrative wing. Decker's team had the floor. The 3 hostiles were contained. The staff were emerging from their sheltered positions in the slow, careful way of people who weren't certain the emergency was over and didn't want to find out the wrong way. The child in the pediatric bay was sitting up with his arms around the neck of a nurse who was holding him with the particular fullness of someone who was also holding themselves together, and that image landed somewhere in Nora's chest and sat there. She pushed through the Bay 9 door. James Ford was sitting up on the edge of the bed with his legs over the side and one hand pressed against his lateral suture, her suture, the one she'd placed 40 minutes ago, and the other hand braced against the mattress. He was pale in the way people were pale after cholinergic crisis, not bloodlessly, but with the gray-green undertone of a body that had been through something significant and was not finished processing it. Anand was standing 2 feet away with her arms slightly out, like someone waiting to catch a person who hadn't fallen yet. Carla was behind her, expression suggesting she had been arguing with this man for several minutes and had found him immovable. Ford looked at Nora when she came in. The feeds, he started. Are intact, she said. Sit down. You don't understand what's on. I understand enough. She crossed to him, put her hand on his shoulder, not aggressive, just present. You're 20 minutes out of a cholinergic crisis. Your acetylcholine receptors are still recovering. Your blood pressure has been unstable, and I don't know yet if your cardiac function is normalized because we haven't had time to run the follow-up. And if you stand up and walk out of this bay, you're going to fall down, possibly permanently. Sit down. He sat. Not because she'd told him to, because his body made the decision when his legs registered the distance between the bed and the floor and sent a message to his brain that the message was not optimistic. He sat and he pressed his hand harder against the suture site, and his face did something that was not quite pain and not quite the look of a person who had just understood something important, but was somewhere between those two things. The drive, he said. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Do you have it? She put her hand in her chest pocket and felt the polymer case and didn't take it out. I have it, she said. You need to get it to Decker, not anyone else. Decker, specifically. I know. There are names on it. I know. He stopped, looked at her. The look was the same one the man in the alcove had given her. The revised model, the recalculation. "Who are you?" he said. "Right now I'm the nurse who's going to reconnect your IV line and take your blood pressure." She reached for the IV tubing. "We can do the other conversation later." He let her reconnect the line. She cycled the blood pressure cuff and watched the numbers, and they were better than she expected. Still low, but trending, the way a body trended when it was doing the work of recovery without assistance, which was the most anyone could ask of a body that had been through what his had. Anand moved around the bed to check his pupils, and Forday submitted to the penlight with the expression of a man who had decided that resistance was temporarily less efficient than cooperation. "He needs to stay horizontal," Anand said, to Nora and not to Ford, which was a choice that said something about the dynamic that had developed in this room over the last 40 minutes. "Agreed," Nora said. "He knows." Ford lay back. He didn't look happy about it. He looked like a man who had made a series of professional choices that had led him to a hospital bed in a city that wasn't his, relying on a woman he'd met 6 minutes ago to protect something that 8 months of work depended on, and who was processing that reliance with the specific difficulty of someone who was not accustomed to needing protection. She understood that. "The name," she said quietly when Anand had stepped back. "The person in the camera feeds. The one you were trying to protect." Ford was quiet for a moment. "You don't need to know that," he said. "I know I don't need to. I'm asking because whatever's on that drive is going to land in the middle of an investigation that's already running hot, and I need to know how many directions this goes before I hand it to Decker." He looked at the ceiling. "It goes in 4 directions. The Callaway Group's distribution network runs through 3 civilian institutions and 1 military contractor. The military contractor is where the modified compound originated. The person in the feeds is an intermediary, civilian, not military. She's been coordinating between the institutions and the network for 14 months. 14 months. The same amount of time Nora had been at Meridian Cross. She sat with that for a second. "What's the contractor's name, what?" she said. Ford turned his head and looked at her. "Why?" "Because 2 years ago I was forced out of a position because of an investigation into a military contractor who was producing modified compounds for private sale. The investigation was shut down, and I was told the contractor had been cleared." She held his gaze. "I'd like to know if I was told the truth." The monitor beeped. Ford's heart rate had gone up 4 points. "Not much. Enough." "Verant Defense Solutions," he said. She had known, before he said it. She had known the way you knew things that had been living in the back of your mind for 2 years. Not confirmed, just suspected. Just weighted with the specific heaviness of something you'd stopped letting yourself think about because thinking about it led to a place she hadn't been ready to go. She was ready now. She stood up and straightened her scrub top and pressed her hand against the polymer case in her pocket one more time, feeling its edges. "Rest," she said to Ford. She went to find Decker. He was in the main corridor running what looked like a field debrief. 3 of his team standing in a rough cluster, one of them with a tablet showing a building schematic, everyone talking in the shorthand of people who had rehearsed this kind of communication. He saw her coming and peeled away from the group. She held out the drive. He took it. He looked at it, then at her, and his expression did something she hadn't seen from Decker in the years she'd known him. Something that was not quite relief and not quite apology, but was somewhere in that range, carrying some of the weight of both. "Olivia," he said. It was the first time anyone had said that name out loud in her presence in 2 years. She hadn't realized, until she heard it, how different it would feel. Not the name itself, which was just a sequence of sounds, but the acknowledgement contained in it that the person standing here was not only Nora Voss, had never been only Nora Voss, had been someone else first, and had carried that someone else for 2 years inside the quieter architecture of this new life. "Don't," she said. "Olivia, not yet." She kept her voice level. "Is Hale who he says he is?" Decker took a breath. "Yes. He came to us 11 months ago with internal documentation on Meridian Cross's pharmaceutical procurement records. Someone was routing Vitrin 7 component precursors through the hospital's supply orders. Small amounts, designed to look like standard chemical inventory for lab use. He caught the irregularity. She absorbed that. Marcus Hale, who had fired her tonight, who had dismissed her twice and escorted her out and treated her for 14 months as a bureaucratic inconvenience, had spent 11 of those months working a covert investigation. That didn't make him easier to like. It made him more complicated, which was different. The woman with him in the corridor, she said. Federal asset. His contact. Decker glanced down at the drive. This is going to move fast now. We've been waiting on a physical link between Verant and the distribution network for 8 months. This is it. Verant Defense Solutions. His expression confirmed it before he spoke. You knew. I suspected. I was told 2 years ago that the investigation was closed and the contractor was cleared. The investigation was closed because someone inside the oversight committee was on Verant's payroll. Decker's voice didn't change register. He delivered this the way he delivered everything, in the flat, informational tone of someone for whom the horror of a thing and the reporting of it had been separated by professional necessity. We have 3 names on that committee. They're on the drive. She stood with that for a moment. 3 people inside an oversight committee who had been paid to close the investigation that had cost her her career, her identity, 2 years of her life, and the version of herself she'd been before all of it. 3 names on a drive that was now in Ryan Decker's hand. She thought about what she was supposed to feel. She wasn't certain she felt it. What she felt was closer to the specific exhaustion of a person who had been running towards something for a long time and had just arrived, which wasn't joy and wasn't relief and wasn't the clean resolution that the word justice implied. It was just arrival. The solid, slightly anticlimactic fact of being where you'd been heading. What happens now? She said. Now my team secures the drive and gets it out of this building. We have a federal prosecutor standing by. This goes to her tonight. He paused. And you need to sit down somewhere and let someone look at your hands. She looked at her hands. They were shaking slightly. The fine tremor of adrenaline metabolism, nothing structural, nothing that would last. She hadn't noticed until he pointed it out. She wasn't sure what that meant about the last several hours. Later, she said. Olivia. I said later. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned back to his team. She stood in the corridor and breathed. The ER around her was doing the slow work of coming back to itself. Staff returning to positions, patients being reassessed, equipment being accounted for. There was damage. A workstation that had taken impact, a cart overturned near the east corridor, the fire door at the east end still hanging wrong on its frame. There was a man sitting against the wall near Bay 4 with his wrists restrained and his expression of someone who understood that the night had not gone the way it was supposed to, which was a reasonable assessment. Anand came out of Bay 9. She walked to Nora and stopped and looked at her with the expression of a person who had several things to say and was deciding on the order. He's stable, Anand said. BP is 110/70 and climbing. Respiratory rate is normal. GCS is 50. Good. I went ahead and ordered a repeat troponin and a 12 lead, in case there was any cardiac involvement from the compound. That's the right call. A pause. Anand looked at the floor, then back up. I've been a resident for 2 years, she said. I've had attendings override my judgment, ignore my assessments, tell me I was wrong when I wasn't. It's a specific feeling when you know something and you can't get anyone to listen. She stopped. I'm sorry I hesitated tonight. When you came back in with the atropine, I should have moved faster. Nora looked at her. You moved fast enough. If I'd been quicker, he made it, Anand. Faster would have been better, but he made it. She held the resident's gaze. You did your job. Anand nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that was receiving something and not quite knowing where to put it yet. She went back to the bay. Nora leaned against the corridor wall. The tremor in her hands had slowed. The adrenaline was metabolizing the way it always did. Through time and stillness, through the body doing the quiet work of returning to baseline, which was never perfectly baseline and never fully returned but was better than the alternative. She had done this after field operations. She had done it in the parking lots of forward operating bases, in the back of transport vehicles, once in a bathroom stall in a military hospital on a base she'd been stationed at for 4 months. The specific aloneness of the minutes after the thing was over, when the only company was the particular version of yourself who had been present for it. She was so tired, not sleepy. The other kind. The kind that was structural. She was standing with her eyes closed when she heard the footsteps. A specific set, heavier on the left, the gait of a man who'd been on his feet for longer than his joints thought was reasonable. She opened her eyes. Marcus Hale was walking toward her with Vasquez 2 steps behind, and his hands no longer raised and his face wearing the expression of a man who had set down something heavy and didn't know yet how to hold himself without the weight of it. He stopped in front of her. She waited. "The atropine," he said. "The pralidoxum. The suture." He stopped. "You knew exactly what to do and how to do it, and you didn't hesitate once." She didn't say anything. "Where did you learn that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. She held his gaze. "I wasn't only ever a nurse." Hale absorbed that. His eyes moved over her face in the way of a man reading a document he'd misunderstood the first time, trying to locate where his comprehension had failed. He had fired her tonight. He had dismissed her twice and had her removed by security, and she had come back in 2 times and saved a man's life and protected evidence that 8 months of federal investigation depended on. And he was standing in front of her in a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and the residue of a very bad night, and he did not have the language for this yet. "I was wrong about you," he said. It was the simplest version of the thing, and it was also the true one, and she respected that he'd said it plain. "You judged what you saw," she said. "You didn't know what was underneath." He nodded once and moved past her. Vasquez followed. Nora pushed off the wall and was about to move back toward the bay when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Not Decker's encrypted line. A different flatness in the digital signal. A different architecture. She answered. No voice. Just ambient sound. The specific acoustic texture of a large indoor space, echoing, concrete, the distant resonance of ventilation systems. Then a voice. Male. Older. The kind of voice that had learned to be calm as a professional trait and not a personal one. "Captain Hayes," the voice said. Not Voss. Not Olivia. The rank. The old name. "You've had a productive evening," the voice continued. "I want you to know that what you found tonight is incomplete. The drive that you gave to Decker, it has names on it. What it doesn't have is the name above those names." A pause. "That would be mine." She stood very still. "I'd like to discuss the terms of a more complete arrangement," the voice said. "You have something I want. I have something you want. Specifically, I have the original investigation file from 2 years ago, not the redacted version your attorney received, the complete file. The version that shows exactly who authorized the order to reassign you and why, and who signed the paperwork that made you disappear." Another pause, measured and deliberate. "I think you'd like to see that." The corridor around her was busy and bright and full of people doing the ordinary, extraordinary work of putting things back together. None of them could hear this call. None of them knew she was standing in the middle of it. "How do I know you have it?" she said. "You were reassigned from FOB Callister on a Tuesday. Your file was processed by a colonel whose name was redacted in the version you received. His name was Gerald Warren." A beat. "He's been dead for 14 months. Heart attack, or so the official report states. I have the other report." She said nothing. She was counting things. The number of people who would know the FOB designation, the colonel's name, the specific day of the week. The number was very small. "I'll be in touch," the voice said. "Don't go too far." The line went dead. She stood with the phone in her hand and the corridor moving around her and the weight of everything she'd just been handed settling into her like a depth charge. Something that sank slowly and would go off later, at the bottom of something dark, with force proportional to the fall. Decker's team was 20 feet away. Ford was in Bay 9, alive. The drive was in federal custody. And somewhere in a large concrete space with good acoustics and no ambient traffic, a man whose name was not on the drive, whose name was above every name on the drive, had just made her an offer she had no safe answer to. She looked at her phone. Then she looked at the ER around her, the place she had worked for 14 months under a name that was not hers, doing work that mattered in a way she'd never been allowed to say out loud, being dismissed and overlooked and underestimated by people who only ever saw the surface, who never once wondered what was underneath. She had given Decker the drive. She had not told Decker about the call. Not yet. She needed to think, and thinking required something she hadn't had in 2 years, the complete picture, every edge of it, the parts she'd been allowed to see, and the parts that had been cut away and held from her by people who signed their names to documents that made other people vanish. She needed that file, and she was already calculating, in the back of the mind that had been trained to calculate in exactly these conditions, what it would cost to get it. She gave herself 4 minutes. That was what she had before Decker would notice she hadn't moved, before Vasquez would loop back through the corridor, before the operational tempo of the next phase would pull everyone's attention in a direction that required her to be accounted for. 4 minutes to think without being managed. She walked to the break room. It was empty. The overhead light had been left on. Someone had left in a hurry and hadn't come back. And the room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a space that absorbed stress as a professional function. There was a half-eaten sandwich on the counter that she recognized as Carla's, still in its wax paper wrapping, abandoned when the first alarm had sounded. She sat down in one of the plastic chairs and put her phone on the table and looked at it. The voice on the call had known things. That was the first and most important fact, and she worked from facts when she could because they were the only ground that held. F.O.B. Callister, Colonel Gerald Warren, the specific day of the week. Those details lived in a file that was classified at a level that narrowed the pool of people who could access it to a very small number, and within that pool the number who would use that access to make this kind of call was smaller still. She thought about what the voice had offered. The complete file, the unredacted version. She had received her file through a legal process 18 months ago. An attorney who'd spent 4 months navigating the declassification request and had produced, in the end, a document that was 40% black bars. She had read what remained, and she had understood the shape of what was missing better than the shape of what was there. The way you understood a room by its shadows. The black bars covered 3 things: the name of the officer who had authorized her reassignment, the name of the oversight committee member who had approved the investigation closure, and the name of the contractor whose cleared status had been the central fact around which everything else had been arranged. She had guessed at all 3. She had been right about the contractor. She was now in a position to be right about the rest. The question was what the voice wanted in exchange, which it had called an arrangement without specifying terms, which meant the terms were designed to be proposed in person, in a context the voice controlled, which was exactly the kind of trap she would have set in the same position. She picked up her phone and called Decker. "I need 5 minutes," she said when he answered. "I need you out front in 3. We're moving forward to a secure facility, and I want Ryan." She used his first name deliberately. She had used his first name approximately 4 times in 8 years. "I got a call. After I gave you the drive, someone with access to my classified file." Silence. "How long ago?" he said. 6 minutes. "What did they want?" "To make an arrangement. They have the original investigation file, unredacted, and they want to trade it." She paused. "They called me Captain Hayes." Another silence. Longer. "Come out front," he said. His voice had changed. Not the informational register, not the professional calm. Something underneath that, where the professional calm had been learned on top of something that was not calm at all. "Right now. Don't go anywhere else first." She went out front. Decker was standing beside one of the black vehicles with his phone in his hand, and an expression she had not seen on him before, which in 8 years of knowing him was notable because she'd seen most of them. It was the expression of a man who had just been handed a variable that changed the entire equation and was deciding in real time whether to tell her that. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "We ran the phone number from your incoming call. Disposable. Routed through 3 relays. We can't trace it." He stopped. "But the relay patterns, the architecture of the routing, is consistent with internal military communications infrastructure, not civilian encrypted. Military." She stood with that. "Which means whoever called me is still inside," she said, "or has access to infrastructure that should require active military credentials." He paused. "We have people running it, but Olivia, The number of people with that access and knowledge of your specific file details is small, she said. Very. She thought about the voice. Male, older, the specific cadence of authority worn as a second skin, the calm that was professional and not personal. She had known people with that quality. She had worked under several. Most of them had been what they appeared to be. One of them hadn't. Is General Warren Pruitt still active? She said. Decker went very still. He retired 14 months ago, he said carefully. 14 months ago. The same month Hale had reported the pharmaceutical irregularities to federal investigators. The same month she had been at Meridian Cross long enough to have settled into a routine, to have become, theoretically, findable. Pruitt oversaw the contractor review board that cleared Verant, she said. He was 3 levels above Colonel Warren. He would have had access to my complete file as part of the oversight process. Yes. And he retired the same month your investigation started picking up traction. Yes. She looked at the parking lot. The rain had stopped somewhere in the last hour. The asphalt was wet and flat and reflecting the hospital's exterior lights in long orange streaks. A normal parking lot, the kind you saw from the window of a break room without registering it. He's going to contact me again, she said. He gave me an offer and he's going to want an answer, and the answer he wants is that I'll come meet him, which gives him the opportunity to retrieve whatever he thinks I still have and eliminate the person who can connect him to the oversight failure. She kept her voice even. He doesn't know the drive is already in federal custody. He thinks I have it and haven't turned it over because I want to negotiate. That's a reasonable assumption on his part, Decker said slowly, based on what he knows. She looked at him. It's also an opening, she said. He looked back at her for a long moment. The calculation he was running was visible in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes moved to the phone in her hand and back to her face. He was doing the math of what she was proposing against the math of what could go wrong with it, and there was a lot of both. I can't authorize you to... I'm not asking you to authorize me. She kept her voice quiet. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Pruitt is going to call again, and I'm going to take the meeting, and I'm going to go in wired. And I'm going to give your prosecutor the complete file and whatever he says in that room. She paused. And then it's done. If he makes you pee, he won't. You don't know... Ryan, she said it the way she'd said it on the phone, direct, without heat. I've been in rooms with people who wanted to eliminate me for 8 years. I know how to hold a conversation in those rooms. She looked at the parking lot again. And I know what I'm doing this for. He was quiet for a moment. I want a full team in position before you go in, he said. I want eyes on you the entire time. And I want the meeting in a location he'll choose the location. Then we scout it first. Agreed. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture she'd seen from him exactly once before, in a field situation where the options had been uniformly bad, and they'd had to pick one anyway. If this goes wrong, then you'll have a complicated report to write. She turned toward the hospital entrance. I need to check on Ford, and I need to talk to Anand about the follow-up protocol for his recovery. Olivia, she stopped. For the record, Decker said, you should have been brought back in a year ago. When we first identified the variant connection, I pushed for it, and I was overruled, and I want you to know that I... Write it in the report, she said. Not unkindly. We'll talk about the rest later. She went back inside. The hospital at 2:30 in the morning was doing what hospitals did after violent things happened in them. The quiet, methodical work of putting the structure back in order, while simultaneously continuing to be a place where people needed care, because the two things didn't pause for each other. Patients who had been awake for the breach were being settled. Staff who had been frightened were doing the thing that people did when they were frightened and couldn't stop working. They worked harder, faster, with a focused intensity that looked like competence, and was also a form of not thinking about what they'd seen. She found Carla in the medication room. Carla was standing at the dispensing cabinet with a printout in her hand and an expression that suggested she had been standing there for a while without actually reading the printout. She looked up when Nora came in. He's asking for water, Carla said. Ford. He's been asking for water for 20 minutes, and Anand said he could have some, and I brought it, and he drank it, and then he asked for more, and I brought it again, and then he asked me who you were. She set the printout down. I didn't know what to tell him. What did you say? I said you were the nurse who'd been here longer than anyone knew. Carla looked at her. Was that wrong? Nora considered it. No, that's about right. Carla folded her arms. She was the kind of person who processed things physically, who needed to occupy her hands when her mind was doing the harder work. And right now her hands were holding her own elbows, which was the equivalent of holding herself together with available materials. Who are you, Nora? Actually, the question was simple and it deserved a simple answer, and the simple answer was complicated, which was also a kind of answer. Someone who should have been honest with you a long time ago, Nora said. I wasn't, and I'm sorry for that. Are you in danger? I've been in danger. I'm managing it. That's not the same as no. No, Nora said. It's not. Carla unfolded her arms. She picked up the printout, put it down again, looked at the cabinet. If you need anything, from me. From anyone on this floor. She stopped. We're here. Whatever that's worth. Nora looked at her. It's worth more than you think. She left the medication room and went to check on Ford. He was sitting up at a 40-degree incline, which was the most the bed's current configuration allowed, and he was drinking water with the focused attention of someone who had recently understood that water was not a given. His color was better. The gray-green undertone was gone. He looked like a man who had been very sick and was no longer very sick, and who was now in the specific cognitive state of someone metabolizing the full scope of what had happened to them. He looked at her when she came in. You're still here, he said. So are you. She checked his monitor. How's the incision? Sore. It'll be sore for a week. Don't stretch the lateral if you can avoid it. She adjusted the drip rate on the IV. Decker's moving you to a secure facility in about an hour. You'll have a full medical team there. What about you? I'll be here. He was quiet for a moment. I've been in the field for 11 years, he said. I've had medics work on me in a lot of situations. Not one of them pulled a suture from a lateral incision under active threat conditions, while simultaneously coordinating a pharmaceutical intervention for a cholinergic crisis. He paused. Not even the good ones. She didn't say anything to that. The list of people who can do that is short, he said. The list of people who can do that and are currently working a night shift in a mid-sized ER in Harwick is shorter. He turned his head to look at her directly. Decker told me your name, your real name. One of them, she said. A beat. Captain Hayes, he said. I read the Varant investigation brief 18 months ago as part of my case prep. Your name was redacted, but the description of the officer who identified the compound modification protocol, the methodology, the specific field assessment criteria, I've been thinking about it for an hour and a half, and you are that officer. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down, which was the first time she'd sat down since 11:30 p.m., and the act of sitting registered in her body in a way that was disproportionate to the actual physical relief it represented, the way certain things did when you'd been running on adrenaline long enough that even a small reduction in physical demand landed like something larger. I identified the modification, she said. I reported it. The report was buried, and I was reassigned, and 6 months after that, I was out entirely, and my record was classified at a level that made disputing any of it effectively impossible. She looked at the monitor. The investigation I started became someone else's investigation without my involvement or knowledge, and then it was closed, and then 2 years later it became your investigation. And tonight it became finished, he said. She thought about the call, the voice, the offer. Almost, she said. He caught it. There's more. There's more. He set down the water cup. He was reading her the way people in the field learn to read people. Not the surface, not the expression, but the posture, the weight distribution, the specific quality of stillness that meant a person was holding something back. Do you need my help? She looked at him. You're 20 minutes out of a cholinergic crisis. You're 20 hours into a situation that started before I arrived and apparently predates my entire investigation by 2 years. He held her gaze. That's not a no. She almost said it was. She could see the argument. He was a patient. He was her patient, technically. She had spent the last 2 hours fighting to keep him alive and asking him to assist with whatever came next was a different kind of risk than the physical one she'd already spent. But he was also a federal operative with 11 years of field experience who was awake and oriented and had a GCS of 15 and was looking at her with the expression of someone who understood exactly what they were offering. "When Pruitt contacts me again," she said, "and he will, I may need a secondary verification that the federal case is protected before I go into that meeting. Something Pruitt can't intercept or preempt." She paused. "A channel that doesn't go through Decker." Ford looked at her for a moment. "You don't trust Decker?" "I trust Decker. I don't trust every layer above Decker." She was honest about it because there wasn't time to be otherwise. Pruitt had military infrastructure access. Someone above Decker is the level at which that access becomes available, and until I know how far the compromise goes, I want a parallel line. Ford nodded slowly. "I have a contact at the federal prosecutor's office. Direct line, not routed through the investigation team. Her name is Avery Strand. She's been on standby for the drive delivery." He paused. "She can receive a direct brief from you that doesn't require the chain. Will she take my call?" "Tell her Garrett protocol. She'll take it." She stood up. "Rest," she said. "I mean it." She was at the bay door when he spoke again. "Captain Hayes," he said. She turned. "Whatever they told you when they pushed you out," he said, "it wasn't true. Your assessment of the Varant compound modification was correct. It's been correct the entire time. The investigation we've been running for 8 months, every piece of it, is built on the foundation of what you reported 2 years ago." He stopped. "You were right. You were just alone." She stood in the door for a moment. The monitor behind him beeped steadily, and the overhead light in Bay 9 was the same fluorescent overhead that had been there since she started. The same slight flicker at the left end that facilities had been promising to fix for 6 months. Everything familiar, everything slightly altered. "Get some rest," she said. She went out. The next 90 minutes moved in segments. Decker's team cleared and logged the security control room footage and handed the authentication chain to a federal courier who arrived in a gray sedan that was aggressively ordinary. The 3 hostiles from the breach were processed and transported, not to local custody, to federal, which meant the conversation about what they knew and who had sent them would happen in a room that Nora would never see. Hale gave a 2-hour statement to Vasquez in the physician's lounge. The door closed, his voice occasionally audible as a low murmur through the wall. Ford was moved to the secure facility at 4:15 a.m. in a transfer that was documented as a standard interfacility patient transport, and which involved 6 people and 2 vehicles and a level of coordination that looked from the outside like nothing at all. Nora stayed on the floor. She helped restabilize 2 patients whose care had been interrupted by the breach. She restocked the crash cart that had been raided. She changed into a clean set of scrubs from the staff locker room because her original set had blood on it that she hadn't noticed until she passed a mirror, which was typical, which was always how it happened. At 4:47, her phone rang. Same number as before. Same acoustic signature. Large space, concrete, ventilation. "Captain Hayes," the voice said, "have you had time to consider my offer?" "I have," she said. She was in the stairwell, the one place in the building she was reasonably certain was not under surveillance by anyone currently in the building. She'd chosen it deliberately. "I want to see a verification. 1 page of the file, the signature page from the oversight closure, something I can authenticate." A pause. "You're careful." "I've had practice." "The page can be arranged." Another pause. "I'd like to meet tonight, before the morning news cycle makes certain things more complicated." "Where?" "The Harwick Port Authority building. East Dock, secondary warehouse. Do you know it?" She did. She had run her perimeter routes through the port district for 14 months. She knew the warehouse, a mid-sized structure, partial lighting, 3 access points, sightlines compromised by container stacks on the south side. A space that someone who wanted control of a meeting would choose. "I know it," she said. 3 hours. Come alone." "I'll come alone," she said. She hung up and stood in the stairwell for a moment, and then she called the number Ford had given her. It rang twice. "Strand," a woman's voice said, clipped, awake, the voice of someone who'd been sitting by the phone. "Garrett Protocol," Nora said. "My name is Olivia Hayes. I need to brief you on a secondary development in the Verant investigation before I go into a meeting with a subject who is not on the primary drive. A half-second pause. Talk to me, Strand said. She talked for 8 minutes. She gave Strand everything: the call, the offer, Pruitt's name, the file, the meeting location and time. She gave it clean and sequential without editorializing, the way she'd been trained to brief, the way she still could after 2 years of not doing it. Strand asked 4 questions, all of them precise, none of them unnecessary. She was a good prosecutor, Nora could tell by the questions. I can have surveillance assets at the port within 90 minutes, Strand said. Independent of Decker's team, operating under my authority as case prosecutor. That's what I need. I want audio from the meeting. If he produces the file, I want it in an authenticated chain of custody from the moment he hands it to you. Understood? Captain Hayes. Strand's voice shifted register. Not softer, but different, the professional register giving way briefly to something adjacent. The oversight failure that ended your career? It's in the record. I've read the redacted version, and I've read enough between the lines to understand what it cost you. When this is over, I want to talk to you about a formal review of your service record. Nora held the phone. One thing at a time, she said. She went to find Decker. He was in the parking lot running a debrief with 2 of his team, a tablet between them, reviewing the camera feeds. He looked up when she approached and read her immediately. The phone in her hand, the direction she'd come from, the specific quality of her posture that said she'd made a decision while he wasn't watching. He called back, Decker said. Yes. You're going. In 3 hours, Eastdock warehouse at the port. He swore once, quietly, in the way of someone who'd been expecting this and had still hoped for a different outcome. I want 4 people on the perimeter. Strand is handling surveillance independently. I don't want crossover that he can detect. Decker looked at her hard. You called Strand. Ford gave me her number. Of course he did. He rubbed the back of his neck. He was tired. Everyone was tired. The night had been long in the way that some nights were long. Not in clock time, but in the weight of what had happened inside it, which aged people in a way that sleep only partially addressed. I'm going to be outside that warehouse whether you want me there or not. I know, she said. Stay far enough back that he doesn't have reason to check the perimeter before we're inside. A pause. What's your read on him? Pruitt? She thought about the voice, the steadiness of it. The specific confidence of a man who had been operating at a level where consequences didn't reach him, who had retired into what he believed was permanent insulation from accountability, and who was now discovering that the insulation had limits. Men like that were predictable in their unpredictability. They'd held the controls for so long that their contingencies were all about power, not survival. They didn't plan to run. They planned to win. He thinks he can still come out of this ahead, she said. That's what makes him dangerous and also what makes him manageable. Decker looked at her for a long moment. Have I told you that you're the most composed person I've ever worked with while simultaneously being the most difficult to manage? Not in those words. I'm telling you now. She almost smiled. Get your people in position. I'll check in at the 2-hour mark. She went back inside. The hospital at 5 a.m. had the specific quality of a building that had been through something and was in the process of deciding what came next. The emergency that had defined the last 4 hours was resolving into paperwork and process, and the slow institutional machinery of incident reporting and staff debriefs and administrative review, and those things would take days and weeks and would be difficult in ways that were entirely different from the difficulty of the night itself. But the building was standing. The patients were alive. The staff who had pressed themselves against walls and covered strangers and made decisions in the dark that they hadn't trained for and had made correctly anyway. They were still here, getting back to work, because that was what the place required, and they had chosen to work in it. She found Marcus Hale in the corridor outside the physician's lounge. He had the look of a man who had given a very long statement and who was now standing in his own ER at 5 a.m, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. He looked at her when she approached and set the coffee down on the windowsill with the specific deliberateness of a man choosing not to be holding something. Vasquez says I can go home, he said. You should, Nora said. There's nothing productive you can do here right now. My department will be here when you come back. She paused. Your department is intact because of what you did 11 months ago. Whatever you think about tonight, about me, that part is yours. He looked at her with the complicated expression that had been living on his face since the corridor. I spent 14 months treating you like a liability, he said, because you were too competent at things I didn't understand, and it made me nervous. He said it flat, without softening, which was either self-awareness or exhaustion, or both. That's not something I can... No, she said. It's not. He nodded. I'll be back for morning rounds. I know you will. He picked up his cold coffee and walked toward the exit, and she watched him go with the complicated feeling of someone who had been wronged by a person who was not entirely wrong, which was most people in most situations, which was the texture of the actual world as opposed to the simplified version. She had 2 hours and 40 minutes before the port warehouse. She spent an hour of it at a patient's bedside. A 60-year-old woman named Doris, who had been in Bay 3 for a kidney stone since 10 p.m., and who had been entirely ignored during the chaos of the last several hours, because her condition was stable and her bay was on the opposite end of the floor from where everything had happened. Doris was awake and annoyed, and had been awake and annoyed for 4 hours, and had nobody to be annoyed at, and Nora sat with her and managed her pain medication, and listened to her talk about her daughter, who lived in Portland, and the dog she'd had to leave with her neighbor, and the specific insult of a kidney stone in the middle of the week when she had things to do. It was the most normal thing that had happened since 11 p.m., and Nora was grateful for it in a way that was disproportionate to the situation and which she didn't try to analyze. At 6:15, she checked her phone. Nothing from Pruitt. Nothing from Strand yet, but that was expected. Surveillance setup took time, and Strand would check in at the 1-hour mark. She stood up, said goodbye to Doris, and went to the locker room to change back into street clothes. She was pulling on her jacket when Carla appeared in the doorway. There's something you should see, Carla said. The something was on the nursing station monitor, a news feed, local Harwick station, the kind of low production value morning news that ran before the professional anchors came in, staffed by a single reporter who looked like she'd been called in at short notice and was reading from a tablet she was only partially comfortable with. But the content wasn't low production value. The chyron read, Federal Arrest, Retired Military Official. Varant Defense Solutions Investigation. Nora stopped. The reporter was saying something about an early morning arrest, a federal warrant, a connection to a multi-agency investigation into defense contractor misconduct. She was saying a name, Warren Pruitt, retired brigadier general, taken into federal custody at his home in the Harwick Waterfront District at 5:47 a.m. Nora stood at the nursing station and watched the screen. Strand had moved faster than the meeting. Strand had used what Nora had given her, the name, the connection, the call record, and had moved on Pruitt before the port warehouse, before the meeting, before any of the things that Nora had spent the last 2 hours preparing for, which was the right call, which was the correct prosecutorial decision, which meant that the meeting at the East Dock was now a warehouse that nobody was going to, and an offer that was no longer operable, because the man who'd made the offer was in handcuffs in a federal vehicle somewhere in the Harwick Waterfront District at 5:47 in the morning, which meant it was over. Except Nora was looking at the chyron and feeling something that was not the relief she'd expected, which made her look harder at the screen, at the reporter's face, at the specific phrasing that the reporter was using. Federal arrest, federal warrant, federal custody. And she was listening to what the reporter wasn't saying, which was the name of the prosecutor, the name of the investigating agency, the specific statute. She pulled out her phone and called Strand. Straight to voicemail. She called Decker. He picked up on the first ring. Are you watching the news? Yes, she said. Did Strand authorize the arrest? A pause. 1 second. 2. We're trying to reach her, Decker said. The cold that went through her then was not dramatic. It was the specific cold of a very clear thought arriving with complete clarity. The kind of clarity that felt like falling, because it had that quality of suddenly understanding the distance between where you were standing and the ground. Strand's line was dead. The arrest on the news used language that didn't match federal procedure. And the complete file, The unredacted file that Pruitt had offered her, the file that contained the names above the names on the drive, the file that was the only documentation of the oversight failure that had dismantled her career, was in Pruitt's possession, and Pruitt was now in custody, and the chain of custody for what he was carrying had not been established by anyone she trusted. "Someone got to him first," she said. "We don't know. Ryan." She was already moving toward the exit. "Someone got to him before Strand could, before you could, before any of this was official. They're using a federal arrest to pull him out of reach before he can produce that file." She pushed through the door into the parking lot. "If that file disappears into an unofficial custody chain, I know. Then everything above the names on the drive stays buried. Pruitt walks inside of 6 months, and the people above him never surface at all." "I know," Decker said again, and his voice was the voice of someone who knew and didn't have an answer yet, which was worse than not knowing. She stood in the parking lot in the early morning light. The sun was coming up behind the cloud cover, not dramatically, not with any visual grace, just the slow gray brightening of a sky that was going to be overcast all day, probably. The harbor was visible from the hospital's east side. She could see a strip of it between two buildings, flat and gunmetal colored, the kind of view that told you almost nothing about the water except that it was there. Whoever had called her, whoever had arranged the meeting at the port, whoever had offered the file, they had also been prepared for the meeting not to happen. They had a contingency. Of course they had a contingency. Men at that level always had a contingency. And the contingency was that if the meeting failed, the file moved, and the file moved into a custody chain that looked official enough to satisfy a morning news cycle and was controlled enough to make the file disappear before any competent prosecutor could authenticate it. She had given Strand the name, and Strand had moved, and it had been the right move with the wrong timing, and now the one piece of evidence that could surface the people above the people on the drive was in a chain of custody that nobody she trusted controlled. Her phone buzzed. Text. Unknown number. Different from the call. 2 words. Check Bay 9. She was moving before she finished reading it. The parking lot, the entrance, the corridor. She covered it in under 90 seconds and pushed through the Bay 9 door without breaking stride. And what she found inside stopped her in a way that the entire night had not quite managed to stop her, because the thing that stopped her was not a threat or a crisis, but the opposite of one. And she had been calibrated for threats for so long that the opposite hit her system with the disorientation of an unexpected key change. Ford was sitting up in bed with a tablet in his lap. He looked up when she came in. His color was genuinely better now. Not the artificial better of adrenaline, but the real improvement of a body that had been through something and was processing its way back. He held up the tablet without preamble. On the screen was a document. She crossed to him and took it and read. It was 12 pages. The header was a federal prosecutor's letterhead. Avery Strand's office, the address she recognized from the case filing she'd read in the waiting period after Ford had given her the contact. The document was time-stamped 43 minutes ago. It was a warrant application, emergency, sealed, and attached to it, embedded in the filing as authenticated exhibits, were 17 pages of scanned documentation, the unredacted file. She looked at Ford. "Pruitt carried a backup," Ford said. "He was thorough, I'll give him that. The original file on a drive, a paper copy in a personal safe at his home office, and a third copy transmitted to a secure server he maintained independently of any military system." He paused. "The third copy was the mistake. The server was registered under a shell company that's been in Strand's peripheral investigation for 8 months. When Strand moved on Pruitt this morning, her team pulled the server simultaneously. The file was there." She was still reading. The signature page. Colonel Gerald Warren's name, unredacted, beneath an authorization memo dated 4 years ago. Above it, the countersignature of the Oversight Committee member who had approved the investigation closure. A name she had guessed at and been right about. Deputy Director Leonard Fasano of the Defense Acquisitions Review Board, whose retirement 18 months ago had been covered in 3 paragraphs in an industry newsletter, and who had since been living in a private residence in coastal Virginia with no public profile. And above Fasano's name, in the section marked Executive Authorization, the signature she had been waiting 2 years to see confirmed in ink. Warren Pruitt, Brigadier General, active service, dated the same week her reassignment papers had been processed. He had signed it himself. Not delegated, not routed through a deputy. He had personally authorized the closure of her investigation, the clearing of Verant Defense Solutions, and the classified reassignment that had made her, for all practical purposes, disappear. She set the tablet down on the bedside table. She stood very still for a moment. Strand formally filed the warrant 40 minutes ago, Ford said. Pruitt's arrest this morning was legitimate. She had moved on the server finding and had enough for the warrant before she arrested him. The file is in authenticated federal custody. Chain of custody is clean. He paused. She called me 20 minutes ago to confirm. That's why I texted you. She looked at her hands. They were not shaking. She found that interesting. Fasano? She said. Federal agents are at his Virginia residence as of 6 a.m. He's been taken into custody for questioning. Ford's voice was the same careful register he'd used all night, precise, unhurried, giving her information without commentary. Strand says the warrant covers all three: Pruitt, Fasano, and the 3 oversight committee members named on the drive. 5 arrests, federal charges, conspiracy, obstruction, procurement fraud, and, he paused, wrongful personnel action under color of federal authority. That last one specifically names you. She sat down in the chair by the bed. Not dramatically, her legs just made the decision and she let them. Wrongful personnel action. The language was bureaucratic and bloodless, and it named exactly what had been done to her. Not in the language she would have chosen, but in the language that would follow these people into federal court, onto a public record, into the kind of documentation that didn't get buried or redacted because it was the charge document itself. There's going to be a formal review of your service record, Ford said. Strand mentioned it. She said to tell you it's not optional on their end. The record correction is required as part of the prosecution's accountability documentation. She mentioned that to me too, Nora said. She's thorough. Yes. A pause. The monitor beeped. Outside the bay window, the hospital floor was shifting into the first rhythms of morning. The change that happened around 6:30 when the night staff handed over and the day staff arrived and the building recalibrated itself around a new set of people who didn't know yet what the night had been. You should go home, Ford said. She almost laughed. I don't... She stopped. She had an apartment 7 minutes from the hospital. She had lived in it for 14 months, and it had a bed and a window that faced east and a plant on the sill that she'd had for a year and that survived primarily because she remembered to water it with the same reliability she brought to everything else. Not perfectly, but consistently enough. She had a home. She had just stopped thinking of it that way. Yeah, she said. I should. She stood up. She checked his IV line one more time, not because it needed checking, but because her hands wanted something to do that was familiar and useful. She checked the suture site, still clean, minimal swelling, the kind of outcome you got from careful work done in bad conditions, which was not elegant but was real. Captain Hayes, Ford said. She turned. For what it's worth, he said, I've been doing this for 11 years and I've never seen anyone manage what you managed tonight. The veteran identification, the intervention, the drive extraction, the camera feeds, the Hale situation, the Pruitt call, all of it concurrently under active threat in a building that wasn't supposed to be yours anymore. He held her gaze. That's not a compliment. That's a record. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She had assessed that in the first 10 minutes of knowing him, and the last several hours had confirmed it. Get better, she said. And next time you carry a subcutaneous drive into a civilian medical facility, put it somewhere a standard trauma assessment won't miss. He almost smiled. Noted. She left the bay and walked down the corridor that she had walked hundreds of times for 14 months, that she knew by its sounds and its smells and the specific quality of its fluorescent light at different hours of the day. And she went to the locker room and gathered the few things she kept there, and she sat on the bench for a moment in the particular quiet of a room that nobody was using, and she breathed. She was 40 minutes into that breathing when her phone rang. Decker, she answered. 5 in custody, he said. You've seen the news. Ford showed me the filing. Strand is calling it the most significant defense procurement fraud prosecution in 11 years. She's holding a press conference at 9. A pause. Your name is going to come up. I know. How do you want to handle it? She thought about that. The press conference at 9. Her name, one of her names, attached to an investigation and an arrest and a federal prosecution. The shape of a story that other people would tell about what had happened tonight, which would be accurate in its facts and almost certainly wrong in its texture, because the texture of it was not transferable in a press conference or a news segment or any format that required a version short enough for public consumption. Honestly, she said, that's not... I'll talk to Strand's office before the press conference. I'll give them what they need. She paused. But my name stays mine. Nora Voss is a name I chose, and it's a name I'm keeping, alongside the other one. A longer pause. Okay, Decker said. Yeah, okay. Is there anything else you need from me tonight? Not tonight. His voice shifted into something that was not the operational register, not the professional calm, but the underneath of it. The place where Ryan Decker had, in 8 years of working alongside her, revealed himself occasionally and always briefly to be a person and not only a professional. I'm glad you're okay. I should have said that 4 hours ago. You were busy, she said. Still. Ryan, she stopped, started again. Thank you for coming. Always, he said, and hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand. Then she stood up, shouldered her bag, and walked out of Meridian Cross Medical Center into the morning. The sky was the color it had been threatening to be all night. Low cloud, gray-white, the sun somewhere behind it doing the work of a day without the appearance of one. The air smelled like salt and rain residue and the diesel edge of the harbor district, and it was cold in the specific way of early morning in a coastal city, the cold that went through a jacket rather than around it. She stood at the entrance for a moment and let it hit her face. She was walking toward the staff parking structure when she heard her name. Her name, Nora, not Olivia, not Captain, called from the direction of the ambulance bay. She turned. Carla was standing at the bay entrance in her scrubs, jacket thrown over her shoulders, clearly just off the end of a shift that had been longer and stranger than any shift should be. She was holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the machine in the staff lounge, which made terrible coffee that everyone complained about, and which everyone drank anyway because it was there, and it was hot, and sometimes that was what mattered. She held one out. Nora walked over and took it. They stood side by side at the ambulance bay entrance and drank terrible machine coffee in the gray morning and said nothing for a long moment, which was the correct choice, which was the kind of silence that 2 people who had worked together for 14 months and been through a single extraordinary night could share without it being awkward. Doris asked about you, Carla said eventually, before she was discharged, said to tell you you're a good listener. She did most of the talking. That's what makes someone a good listener. Nora drank her coffee. Are you coming back? Carla said. She hadn't answered that question for herself yet. She turned it over, not the logistics of it, whether she could, whether her employment status after tonight was something that could be recovered or reconfigured, but the actual question underneath, which was whether she wanted to. I don't know yet, she said, but I think so. Carla nodded. For what it's worth, she said, this department is better when you're in it. Not because of tonight. Because of every regular shift, every time you caught something nobody else caught, every patient who went home because you were paying attention. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. We didn't deserve you. I think we knew that, in the way you know things you don't say out loud. Nora looked at her. You deserve better institutional support and better leadership decisions. That's a different thing. Maybe. Still. A pause. Go home, Carla said. Sleep. Come back when you're ready. She finished the coffee. She handed the empty cup back to Carla. She said, thank you, which was not adequate and was also the true thing. She went home. Baj. The press conference happened at 9:15. She watched it on her laptop from her kitchen table, still in her jacket, the plant on the windowsill in her peripheral vision, the coffee she'd made herself going cold beside her because she'd forgotten to drink it. Avery Strand was exactly what her voice on the phone had suggested. Compact, precise, The kind of person who chose every word with the specific intentionality of someone who understood that words were tools and that misused tools were liabilities. She stood at the federal courthouse steps in front of a cluster of microphones, and she described, in clear consecutive sentences, the nature of the federal charges against Warren Pruitt, Leonard Fasano, and the 3 oversight committee members whose names were now part of a public federal record. She described the Variant Defense Solutions investigation. She described the drive and its contents. She described the wrongful personnel action. She described Olivia Hayes. Not by name, not immediately. She said, a decorated military medical officer whose investigation was buried by the defendants. And then she said the name, and the name was Olivia Hayes, and it was attached to the word exonerated in a sentence that was read on camera in front of a federal courthouse, and which was therefore part of a permanent record. Nora sat at her kitchen table and listened to her own name being exonerated on a Thursday morning in a mid-sized coastal city, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not vindication, which implied a satisfaction she hadn't arrived at yet, but something earlier than that. Something that was the specific relief of a thing that had been wrong for a long time being named as wrong, publicly, by someone with the authority to name it. It didn't fix what had been broken. She knew that. 2 years of living under a different name in a borrowed life were 2 years she had actually lived, and they were not returnable. And the career she'd had before was not a career she could step back into, unchanged because she was not unchanged. The person who had identified the Vitrine 7 modification on a forward operating base 4 years ago was not the same person who had done it again last night in a Bay 9 in Harwick. And the difference between those two people was made of specific things she had learned and specific things she had lost, and she was not certain she'd trade it, which was a complicated thought, and she let it be complicated. At 10:30, she received a call from a number she recognized as a federal government exchange. Captain Hayes, a man's voice, formal, the particular formality of institutional communication. This is Colonel David Mara, JAG Corbs, Office of Personnel Review. I've been assigned to your service record correction case. I'd like to schedule a formal meeting at your earliest convenience to begin the review process. She looked at the plant on the windowsill. It needed water. She'd been forgetting. Next week, she said. I'm available Monday. Monday works. We'll send the specifics. A pause. Captain, on behalf of the review office, I want to acknowledge that this process should have happened 2 years ago. I'm sorry that it didn't. The apology was institutional. It was also the first official apology she had received in 2 years, and she received it the way she received most things, directly, without performance. Thank you, she said. I'll see you Monday. She hung up and got up and watered the plant. Bam. In the weeks that followed, things happened the way things happened after large events. Not cleanly, not according to any schedule, with frequent reversals and complications and periods where the process felt stalled, and then sudden movements forward that arrived without warning. Pruitt's legal team filed 3 motions in the first 10 days and lost 2 of them. Fasano negotiated a cooperation agreement that Strand described, in a brief call to Nora, as useful and humiliating for him in roughly equal measure, which was a characterization that Nora found accurate and sufficient. The 3 oversight committee members took different paths. One cooperated immediately, one retained aggressive counsel, and fought until the discovery phase made fighting obviously untenable, and one had a health event that complicated the timeline but didn't change it. The charges stood. The cases moved forward. Variant Defense Solutions had its federal contract suspended within 72 hours of the press conference, and its assets frozen within 2 weeks. The company's senior leadership had apparently not been aware of the full scope of what Pruitt and the procurement network had arranged, which did not relieve their regulatory exposure, but did affect the specific shape of it. 3 executives resigned. The company's board issued a statement that was thoroughly inadequate and entirely predictable. Nora read about it in segments, on her phone, on her lunch breaks, because she had gone back to work. Not immediately. She'd taken 6 days first, 6 days that felt strange, in the particular way that unstructured time felt strange to her, too much space and too little direction, the specific discomfort of a person whose coping mechanism was usefulness and who had temporarily run out of things to be useful for. She slept more than she had in months. She walked the harbor district, not the perimeter routes she'd run for 14 months, but the actual waterfront, the tourist-facing part with the seafood restaurants and the piers, the part she'd avoided because visible was the wrong direction when you were trying to disappear. She was not trying to disappear anymore. On the 5th day, she called Meridian Cross. The person who answered was the day shift charge nurse, a woman named Patricia, who had been at the hospital for 12 years and who had been one of the people who'd pressed herself against a wall during the breach, and who had, by all accounts, kept 2 critical patients alive and managed during the chaos of that night with exactly the competence you'd want from someone in her position. "I'd like to speak with Dr. Hale," Nora said. A pause. "Can I ask who's calling?" "Nora Voss." A longer pause. Then, "Hold on." Hale picked up after 30 seconds. He sounded like a man who had also not slept enough in the last week and who had spent a significant portion of that sleeplessness doing the kind of internal accounting that changed how a person moved through the world. "Voss," he said. "I want to come back," she said. "If the position is available." Silence for a moment. "The position is available," he said. "Your employment record has been formally cleared. HR contacted me 4 days ago. The unauthorized access findings from that night were reviewed and," he paused, "determined to be consistent with emergency necessity." That's a very clinical way to describe it. "I'm a clinical person." Another pause. "I'd also like you to consider a secondary role. Trauma protocol review, the ER's assessment criteria for atypical presentations. We've been using the same standard for 6 years, and this week made me understand that the standard has gaps." He stopped. "You know where the gaps are?" She stood in her apartment with the phone and the morning light coming in the east-facing window and the plant on the sill that was doing better since she'd remembered to water it. "I'll think about it," she said. "I'll come in Monday." "Monday," he said. "Good." He didn't apologize again. She didn't need him to. The apology he'd given in the corridor had been the real one, the one that cost him something to say, and the ones that came after that cost nothing, were never the same thing. She respected that he understood the difference. She went back on Monday. The floor was different in the ways you'd expect, and the same in the ways that mattered. The smells, the rhythms, the specific acoustic texture of a space where serious things happened constantly, and where the people who worked in it had developed a particular resilience that was not the absence of being affected, but the capacity to be affected and keep working. Patricia nodded at her when she came in. 2 of the newer nurses looked at her with an awareness that was different from how they'd looked at her a week ago, which she had expected and which she absorbed without comment. The day shift attending who'd been there that night, a man named Dr. Yusuf, who was meticulous and quiet, and who she had worked alongside for a year without exchanging more than professional necessary communication, stopped her at the nursing station and said, "I owe you an observation." And she waited, and he said, "I watched your work for a year, and I understood it as competence. I understand now that I was seeing a much smaller part of what it actually was. I wanted to name that." He said it the way he said everything, precisely, without excess, and then he went back to his charts. She went to work. The day was not dramatic. That was the thing about the actual work. It was never dramatic in the way the stories about it were dramatic, and it didn't stop being hard because the context around it had changed. There was a 63-year-old man with a pulmonary embolism who needed rapid intervention and who was afraid in the way people were afraid when they could feel their own body failing and didn't understand what was happening. And she talked him through the procedure with the same careful clarity she had always brought to it, and he reached the ICU alive and stable. There was a teenager with a forearm fracture who cried and then apologized for crying, and she told him it was fine to cry, that fractures hurt, and the emergency department was one of the places where crying was specifically allowed. There was a woman in Bay 6 whose abdominal presentation was being read as gastrointestinal, and which Nora assessed as a possible ectopic, and she brought it to the attending with the specific directness she had been bringing things to attendings for 14 months, and the attending ordered the ultrasound, and the ultrasound confirmed it, and the patient was in surgery within the hour. Same work, same floor, different weight of it, now that she wasn't carrying the other thing underneath. She ate lunch in the break room. Carla sat across from her with her own lunch, and they talked about the roster change and the new supply ordering system that everyone agreed was worse than the old one, and the rumor that the physician's lounge was getting renovated, which would mean they'd be sharing the break room, which Carla had opinions about. It was the most ordinary 40 minutes of the last week, and it was, for reasons she could not have explained to anyone who asked, the thing that felt most like arrival. The formal service record review was completed in 6 weeks. Colonel Mara ran it the way she'd assessed he would from the first call, methodically, without ceremony, with the specific institutional rigor that made the outcome meaningful rather than merely symbolic. The corrected record included the full reinstatement of her rank, her commendations, and 4 years of service credit. It included a formal notation that her reassignment had been unlawfully authorized, and that her original investigation had been materially correct in all assessed findings, which was the dry language of a military record correction, and was also in its dry way the thing she had been waiting for. She received it on a Wednesday. She read it in her apartment. She set it on the kitchen table and made dinner and ate at the table with the document beside her plate, not reading it again, just knowing it was there. She called her attorney and told her. The attorney said things that were warm and professional and accurate. She called Decker and told him. Decker said good in the tone of someone who had been waiting to hear it and was relieved in a way he would not fully articulate, which was fine, which was how he operated. She did not call anyone else because there was no one else to call in the way she meant it, which was a fact about her life that she had long since made some peace with, and which was also not as fixed as it had been because things were different now. She was different, and different did not always mean worse. She called Ford 3 weeks after the night at Meridian Cross, when he was out of the secure facility and back in a city she didn't know the name of because he didn't say it and she didn't ask. He sounded better, not all the way recovered, because recovery from a cholinergic crisis took time, and his lateral incision was apparently giving him more trouble than she'd hoped, but present and functional and like himself, which was the version of better that mattered. The case is going to trial, he said. All 5. No plea deals on the primary defendants. Strand won't deal. She said she'd consider it for testimony, Ford said, and then she rejected every offer they made, which I appreciated. She's thorough. Impossibly. A pause. How's Harwick? Cold, she said, but I like it. You're staying. I'm staying. He was quiet for a moment. You know, he said, when they told me the hospital I was going to, before I went in, they said it was a small ER in a mid-sized city and not to expect much. I remember thinking it sounded like the most forgettable place I'd ever be sent. Reasonable assumption, she said. I was wrong about that. She stood at her window. The harbor was visible from here too. Not dramatically, not a panoramic view, just a strip of it between 2 buildings, the same gunmetal gray water under the same overcast sky. Ordinary, present, hers. Take care of yourself, Ford, she said. You too, Captain. Months passed, the way months passed when you had decided to be somewhere. Not smoothly, not without difficulty. She had days that were hard in the way work was hard, and days that were hard in the different way that being a person was hard. The days when the weight of the 2 years came back not as crisis, but as something quieter, a heaviness in the morning, a particular loneliness when the shift ended and the parking lot was cold and the drive home was silent. Those days didn't resolve. They lessened. She learned to work with the lessening instead of waiting for resolution, which was a thing she'd known intellectually and had to relearn in her body. She started the trauma protocol review. It took 4 months and involved more disagreement with Hale than she'd expected and less than she'd feared, and the final document was better for the disagreement, which was how most things worked when the people involved were honest about the gaps. 3 hospitals in the region adopted portions of it within the first year. She didn't know whether to find that remarkable or simply correct. She settled on correct. She was in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon in the early spring, not doing anything particular, just eating a sandwich and reading something on her phone, when Carla came in and said, "There's someone at the front desk asking for you, not a patient." She went to the front desk. James Ford was standing in the lobby in civilian clothes, one hand in his jacket pocket and the other holding a paper bag that looked like it was from the bakery 3 blocks down. He looked like a person who had recovered, mostly, in the ways that showed and some of the ways that didn't, and he looked slightly out of his element in a hospital lobby in a way that he hadn't looked out of his element at any point during the night she'd met him. "I was in Harwick," he said. "Specifically here," or "specifically here." He held out the bag. "I was told you like the almond ones from Velta's." She took the bag. "Who told you that?" "Decker. Decker has never seen me eat a pastry." He asked Carla. She looked at the bag. She looked at Ford. He had the expression of a man who had accomplished something and was not quite admitting it. "How's the lateral?" she said. "Healed, scar tissue." He paused. "Your suture work is going to haunt me for the rest of my life." "Is that a complaint?" "The opposite." He was quiet for a moment. "I testified last week, Pruitt's trial, pre-testimony deposition." He looked at her. "Your name came up." "My name comes up a lot these days." In this context, it came up as the reason the evidence chain was intact, the reason the feeds were preserved, the reason I'm alive to testify. He paused. "The prosecutor's team wanted me to describe the sequence of events, and I described them accurately and completely, and the attorneys on the other side had nothing to say about any of it because the sequence of events does not benefit from their commentary." She held the bag. Through the lobby window, the spring light was doing something the winter hadn't been able to, coming in at an angle that hit the floor tiles and made them look almost warm. "Is he going to be convicted?" she said. "Strand thinks so. I think so." Ford's voice was careful and honest. "It's a trial. Nothing is certain. But the evidence is thorough, and the record is clear, and the judge has not been sympathetic to the defense's procedural challenges." He met her eyes. "They're going to be held accountable. All of them. In public, on the record, with consequences that follow them." She absorbed that. She had learned not to hold expectations too tightly, because expectations were where bitterness lived when things didn't land the way you'd needed them to. But she was also honest enough with herself to know that she wanted this. Not in the abstract, not as a principle about justice, but specifically and personally, the specific accountability of the specific people who had signed documents and buried reports, and made her life into something unrecognizable for 2 years. She wanted the public record. She wanted the named consequences. She wanted the thing that her service record correction had started to give her, completed, confirmed, sealed. She thought it would come. She thought Strand would get there. She was going to live her life in the meantime, because the meantime was her actual life, and she had finally stopped treating it as temporary. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I wanted to." He looked around the lobby, the desk, the waiting patients, the corridor beyond. "Is it strange, coming back here after everything?" She considered the question. The lobby was familiar in the way all of it was familiar. Not comfortable exactly, not the kind of familiar that was warmth, but the kind that was knowledge, the kind that came from being somewhere long enough to understand it. She knew this building. She knew what it asked of people and what it gave them and what it couldn't give them. She knew its sounds and its limitations and the particular combination of skill and luck and stubbornness that kept its patience alive on the harder nights. "No," she said, "it fits better now." She walked him to the entrance and he left, and she stood at the door for a moment watching him go. She was 42 years old. She had been a soldier and a fugitive and a nurse, and she was still all of those things in the ways that mattered. And she had a plant that was doing genuinely well now, and a building she understood and work that was hard and real and hers. The service record on her kitchen table said what it said. The trial would say what it would say, and she would be here, doing what she did, which was paying attention when other people didn't, catching what fell through the gaps, showing up for work in the specific way of a person who understood that showing up was not a small thing, had never been a small thing, even when nobody was watching, especially when nobody was watching. That was the part nobody told you about the people who were underestimated. They didn't usually know they were being underestimated, not fully, not in the moment. They were just doing the work. They were just paying attention. They were just showing up in the quiet and the ordinary and the difficult. And the work was real whether or not anyone had named it yet, and the strength was real whether or not it had been witnessed. The recognition, when it came, didn't create the strength. It just finally let the strength be seen. She went back inside. Bay 4 needed restocking, and the afternoon was going to be busy, and there was a patient coming in from the East Corridor who needed someone paying attention. And that was her. And she was there. And she went to work.